suggested we all jump in the water. I was kind of up for it, as my dad said it would be perfect to jump in. For that reason, we all brought towels. The girls seemed more eager than Rodney and I, though. The two got into their underwear and walked into the lake, exclaiming it was actually warm. I told them I'd go in after setting up the campfire at least, since we had already gathered some wood. Starting the fire proved to be especially difficult for me, because I just couldn't get the wood to catch. I'm not exactly a Boy Scout. Rodney took over, and as I watched him try to start the fire, one of the girls started screaming and flailing around in the lake. Amanda looked just as confused as Rodney and I. Then Alicia went underwater for a few seconds, and Amanda started to scream she's drowning. I took off my shirt and ran as fast as I could into the water. But when I got to where she was, the water was only up to maybe my waist. I saw her arms still flailing out above the water and splashing about, and I pulled her up above the water. I yelled, "What the hell happened?" She didn't answer right away and ran straight for the campsite, seemingly out of breath. Halfway there, she turned and yelled, "Get out of the water." Amanda and I looked at each other and listened. As I began moving out of the lake, I felt something strong grab around my ankle and try pulling me down. There was a sharp, piercing feeling cutting into my ankle as well. I yelled in a panic and kicked whatever it was with my free leg until I was able to break free. We made it back to the campsite, and Alicia was already sitting down on a cooler, putting pressure on an apparent wound on her ankle. I sat down on another cooler and checked my ankle, and there was a deep but small gash on the right side of my ankle which was pouring out blood. I told Rodney to get us both some band-aids from my first aid kit in the tent. After patching up the wounds, we felt more relaxed and at ease. We just wanted to figure out what the hell that was that grabbed us. I said it might have been an eel. Rodney questioned if eels even live in lakes like this. Alicia said it didn't feel like an eel or a fish. It felt more like a claw. I got chills as she said it, because I got what she was saying, but how would that make any sense? Regardless, we stuck around because whatever got us was in the water, and we were on land. Nothing could happen now. By this point it was dark out. The sun was completely gone, and the only light was from the fire. We were a couple beers deep, talking about life, about mutual friends, and occasionally bringing up that thing in the water again. All was well, until a splash came from out in the water. We all looked over our shoulders at the same time out to the pitch-black lake. Probably just a fish, we figured. We resumed conversation for a few seconds, but then there was another splash. It didn't sound like a little fish jumping out of the water. It sounded like the kind of splashes you'd hear when a person is walking through waist-deep water. The girls wanted us to go check the lake, so Rodney and I took a couple flashlights and went to the edge of the lake, where we were still hearing noises. With the two lights pointed at the water, we scanned the calm surface of the lake until Rodney stopped me and said, "What is that?" I looked at where his light was pointed. There was this object in the water. Well, at first I thought it was an object, but then I realized it resembled the head of some creature. Definitely not any kind of creature that would live in a lake. It seemed like it was just sticking its head out of the water, and we could see the reflection of its eyes. It was looking at us. Then it moved, as it rised up slightly out of the lake, making another splashing noise. That's when Rodney and I screamed "Go" to the girls. I remember Rodney saying, "Take all your important stuff and go," which was a smart idea. I took all my valuables and left the tent and bigger things. We ran back down the trail to the parking lot, packed the car, and took off down the parkway. The next day, I returned with my dad to collect the tents, but everything that we left in the campsite was destroyed. The tents were shredded, the coolers were scratched and thrown across the site. I told my dad about the creature in the lake. I showed him the gash in my ankle and I asked him what could have done this. He said he had no earthly idea, and we left in a hurry. None of us ever returned to that lake.
My house sits next to a nature preserve on Long Island, New York. I live alone most of the time, besides when my girlfriend who lives out of state comes to visit. Well, I can't say I live completely alone. I have 2 German shepherds, Tate and Moose. They sleep downstairs by the back door of the house. Last week, for 3 nights in a row, I would wake up to the 2 of them barking in the middle of the night at the back door. The first night, I just peeked from the door window into the yard, which was empty. The second night, I actually went outside to the patio to look around, but there wasn't anyone there. On the 3rd night in a row of waking up to barking, I told myself that was it. Someone was creeping around my property every night, causing my dogs to go crazy. I put Tate on his leash and took him out to the yard. Weirdly, he seemed more calm now that he was outside. He wasn't barking at anything. I walked him around the backyard and by the tree line to the woods for a little bit, trying to help him pick up on whatever the 2 had been barking at the past 3 nights. Then he started. By the tree line, he started tugging on his leash and barking at something in the woods. Obviously, I couldn't see too far into the woods as it was nighttime, so I let him lead the way into the woods. If someone were to be trespassing on my property every night, I figured the best way to scare them off would be having my dog chase after them. Tate kept pulling and barking as we got deeper into the woods. I was starting to lose my breath just trying to keep up with him. He seemed to be really locked into something specific in front of us. But eventually Tate stopped pulling and barking, and just stood there with his ears bent back, as if he were in a defensive position. He suddenly looked scared, as if he was looking straight ahead at something. I tried looking ahead into the dark woods, but I could only see so much. There was this cracking of a stick or small branch a little ahead that confirmed there was a presence with us in the woods. I took this as a time to call out, "Whoever's out there, you need to stop trespassing on my property. If you don't, I'll either unleash my dogs on you or call the police. Whichever I feel necessary to do." There was no kind of response or signs of acknowledgement, just another crunch of a twig or stick being pressed into the ground by something, once again confirming there was someone or something standing maybe 10 yards away. I whistled to Tate to follow as I turned us around and headed back to the house. Tate kept looking back every 3 seconds. I'd have to pull him forward just to keep us moving. But then I heard a footstep close behind us, and Tate started to growl and bark again. It was now that I truly started to feel threatened. I didn't have my phone on me, I didn't have my flashlight, my only sense of protection was Tate. Then there was this sound, this unexplainable sound. It was this clicking type noise mixed with this humming sound, almost like a giant bug. Tate started going crazy again. He was barking and pulling, but I held him back. I kept looking at what he was trying to lunge towards, and I finally saw something. There was a set of glowing eyes, only the eyes were set very high off the ground, not down low like from a cat or a raccoon. I started to run back towards my house now. I could see the light from my back patio shining through the trees now. I made it through the tree line back to my backyard. I ran Tate to the back door and let him inside. I turned back to the trees at the opposite end of my yard and I just stood there, listening and waiting for anything. A rustle in the bush made me turn my head about 20 degrees to the right. I saw a figure standing in the woods near the tree line. My patio light lit up the outline of the body somewhat. It looked like it had the shape of a humanoid-like figure, but it was crouched down, kind of hiding behind a little bush. It had extremely long-looking arms in comparison to the rest of its body, and on the lower half of its face, all I saw was black, almost resembling a big gaping mouth. I keep saying it because I knew what I was looking at couldn't be human. I went inside, shut all the blinds, and took my dogs upstairs to my room. I reported an unidentified creature in the preserve to the police. I gave my best description on the phone, and the woman on the other end asked me to call back if the person or creature were to actually enter my private property. Basically, calling the police was for my own peace of mind, but they didn't send anyone. I've been having my dog sleep in my room with me since last week, and there have been no further sightings since. I'll update everyone if anything changes.
My wife and I have lived in our Chapel Hill, Tennessee farmhouse for over 15 years, and for 14 straight years, nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. Our kids have all moved out. It's just me and the wife in the house now. February of 2019, bizarre things started happening. I woke up in the night to my wife shaking me. She said she heard a noise outside the window. She wanted me to go check. I simply walked over to the window, lifted it up, and had myself a look outside. It was chilly out there, so I didn't want to be looking outside for long, but the coast was clear. I shut the window and assured my wife it was okay, then crawled back into bed. Before we could even fall asleep again, there was a noise that made both of us sit up. A sharp but quick click at the window. My wife is no scaredy cat, but she grabbed my arm, clearly worried. She asked me to take the shotgun out there and see who it was. I told her to relax, and I checked the window one more time. I was shocked to find a small scratch in the glass from the other side. I said, "Honey, look at this," and she came over. She put her hands over her mouth and said, "Oh my." What did it? We didn't have a clue. Must have been some big animal, I figured. The next morning, I went outside to inspect the outside by the window. There were no footprints in the dirt by the side of the house. Nothing strange at all outside, actually. So we move on to the next night. It was a rainy, warmer night for February. My wife and I tucked in under the sheets again, and once again there was a sound that could be heard over the rain outside. It was this scraping type sound, muffled of course because it was coming from outside. The sound seemed to be moving closer to the window, then it stopped. My wife and I, sitting up again, looked at each other, and she didn't even have to tell me to go outside this time. I took the shotgun from under the bed again, put on my raincoat, and ran outside as fast as my old bones would allow. My wife turned on the light in the bedroom, which gave me enough light to see these huge scrapes in the vinyl siding. They looked exactly like claw marks. Then I looked down into the mud that I was standing in, and noticed these big feet marks that stopped right before the window, and then turned back in the direction of the woods. I analyzed the marks the best I could, even though they were quickly washing away from the rain. These didn't look like marks from boots, shoes, or any animal that I knew of. They looked like these huge footmarks with claws on the ends. We don't have black bears where we live. 15 years here and we've never seen one, so this just made no sense. I suddenly felt unsafe being out there, even with the shotgun, so I hurried back inside. I told my wife there's some big animal out there, and that as long as we stayed inside, we were safe. We don't have blinds on our bedroom windows, as we don't need privacy from anyone. No one comes out on the property anyway. All I could do was tell my wife to go to sleep. The next night was where things really took the turn for the worst. I woke up around 3 a.m. My wife was still asleep. I sat up, thinking I might have heard something. I realized it was chilly in the room. I looked at the window, and it was open, but that wasn't the first thing I noticed. The first thing I noticed was the head, leaning through the open window into our bedroom. My best description of the head? Inhuman. From the size and shape. It was bigger, and this had a more conish shape. As for facial features, it was just too dark to see any, and it all happened too quickly. I let out one big scream, a type of scream I hadn't heard leave my own body in decades. I went under the bed for the shotgun, but by then, the thing at the window was already gone. My wife was screaming in reaction to my scream. I ran to the window to slam it shut and twist the lock. I told my wife we're sleeping in our son's old room that night. Believe it or not, this was almost a year ago now, and that creature, whatever it was, has never returned. But for 3 straight days, that thing kept coming back to our window, and on the 3rd night, it was halfway into our bedroom.
Number 1. Anaheim, California, 1980. For several months, a single mother named Dorothy Scott had been receiving threatening calls from an obsessive stalker. She had confided in friends and family, stating that the voice sounded familiar, but that she could never quite place it. Having a stalker can be a terrifying ordeal, especially one that constantly calls you up, telling you that they're going to cut you into pieces so that your body will never be found. The caller would routinely describe what Dorothy was wearing or doing at any given moment, just to prove that he was keeping a close and constant eye on her. Dorothy coped as best as she could, and even took up karate lessons as a means of self-protection. She also considered buying a handgun. For the most part, life continued as normal. Until the identity of her stalker was uncovered, there was little else she could do to stop the constant abuse. She continued to go to work, since she needed the money to support her son, Sean. It was at work, on May 28th, that one of her co-workers, Conrad Bostrom, fell sick, with a large red mark appearing on his arm. Dorothy and another employee, Pam Head, took him to the hospital. It was in the emergency room that doctors came to a surprising conclusion. Conrad had been bitten by a spider, and his arm had become infected. This seemed odd, since he couldn't place a time when this could have happened. Supposing that certain things like this can go unnoticed, he was treated by the doctors well into the night, with Dorothy and Pam waiting for him the entire time. There wasn't any rush, since Dorothy knew that her son was being well looked after by her parents while she was at work. Finally, after hours of examination and treatment, Conrad was discharged, and the three readied themselves to leave. It was then that Dorothy told her two associates to wait for her inside, while she went to get the car and pull it around, a decision that would prove to have horrific consequences. After an unusually long wait, Conrad and Pam were relieved to see Dorothy's car fast approaching the entrance. Actually, it was going a little too fast, and showed no intention of stopping. The high beams flicked on, temporarily blinding them both, and the car sped past them and out onto the main road. Dorothy would never be seen again. Her car was found abandoned 10 miles away in a Santa Ana alleyway. It was on fire. No trace of Dorothy could be found inside. Now, this case is disturbing in its own right, but what makes it particularly chilling is the abductor's twisted and sadistic dedication to causing grief. Almost every Wednesday for the next 4 years, Dorothy's mother would receive a daytime call when she was home alone. Each time, it was the same low, gruff male voice, saying things like, "Is Dorothy there? I've got her. I killed her." Whoever the caller was, he wasn't stupid. He never stayed on the line long enough to be traced. Even though many of the calls were recorded, he'd been using an obviously disguised voice. As such, nobody could identify him. In mid-1984, just over 4 years after Dorothy had disappeared, a construction worker happened upon a set of dog bones in some brush off Santa Ana Canyon Road. Just underneath these dog bones, covered only by light soil, were a human pelvis, an arm, 2 thigh bones, and a skull. These bones were later identified to be Dorothy Scott's. A watch found along with the body had stopped at 12:30 a.m., May 29th, 1980. On the day that the newspapers announced that Dorothy's body had been found, the Scott family received 2 final calls. It was the same familiar voice. "Is Dorothy there?" Whoever killed Dorothy was sick enough to have tormented her parents for the best part of 4 years, never allowing them to find closure or come to terms with their loss. Such sadistic dedication suggests that the killer was totally psychopathic. With such a disregard for human life, it's completely possible that she wasn't this man's only victim. Both of Dorothy's parents have since passed away, never knowing the identity of the man that murdered their daughter in 1980. As time ticks by, it seems more and more unlikely that anyone else ever will either. Other than him, of course. Number 2. Encephalitis lethargica, also known as sleepy sickness, was a mysterious plague that suddenly appeared in 1916 and affected millions of people. It attacked the nervous system of the victims, killing a third of those who became infected. Another third recovered, but were mostly left with severe neurological damage. What makes this disease particularly disturbing, however, is what it did to the remaining third. They were left in a state somewhere between life and death, plunged into a slumber that lasted for months, years, in some cases decades. In 1928, it had completely vanished, and nobody knows why. Here's some old footage from 1925 that shows a woman suffering from the sleeping plague. Some of you might be familiar with the disease, as it was the subject of the movie Awakenings with Robin Williams and Robert De Niro, which in turn was based on a book by the same name. It was written by a British neurologist called Oliver Sacks, who helped survivors of the sleepy sickness outbreak, but who remained alive only as living statues. One such patient remained in a statue-like state for over 70 years. Dr. Sacks discovered that administering L-Dopa to those affected by the sickness brought them back to a state of conscious lucidity, if only for a short while. The fact that we still have no idea why the sickness appeared and disappeared so suddenly is somewhat unsettling, but accounts from the lucky ones who recovered revealed the creepy thoughts that swirled in the heads of the dreamers. One patient, known only as Miss R, said that she dreamed she was imprisoned in an inescapable castle, but the castle had the form and shape of herself. She dreamed that she had become a living, sentient statue of stone. She dreamed that the world had come to a stop. She dreamed that she had fallen into a sleep so deep nothing could wake her. She dreamed of a death that was different from death. Imagine how it must feel to be lost in an inescapable nightmare, locked in a body frozen in sleep. As Dr. Sacks observed while treating his patients, many were forgotten about and left to live out the rest of their statued existence in hospitals, nursing homes and asylums, hundreds of thousands of them passing away one by one. During their lucid moments on L-Dopa, he stated that many accepted their hopeless situation with a mournful dignity. Others were resentful, angry about the years that were stolen from them. As Sacks wrote, they yearned incessantly for a twofold miracle, not only for a cure for their sickness, but an indemnification for the loss of their lives. They wanted to be given back the time they had lost. We can only hope that something similar never returns to plague our species. Number 3. 1948, Somerton Beach, Adelaide, Australia. The setting to what has been described as the world's most perplexing cold case. It was the first day of summer in southern Australia, and jeweller John Bain Lyons was taking an evening stroll with his wife. They noticed an immaculately dressed man lying asleep on the beach, his head propped up against the sea wall. His legs were stretched out, and his feet crossed. At first, they assumed he was just some sort of drunk that had passed out on the beach. Watching him from a distance, the man seemed to lift his right arm upwards, and then back down to his side. They thought nothing more of it and continued on their way. Half an hour later, another couple noticed the man in the same position. He was motionless now, with his left arm splayed out in a weird fashion. Stranger, they thought, was his attire. Not many people would choose to wear a full suit with pristinely polished shoes to the beach. His face was covered in mosquitoes. Again, they assumed he had passed out after drinking one too many beers. The next morning, the first passer-by, John Bain Lyons, returned to the beach for an early swim. He noticed the man was still there, propped up against the sea wall, and he hadn't moved an inch. Lyons went over to check on him. The man was cold to the touch and had been dead for some hours. Looking at these pictures, there's something unsettling about his pose, perhaps because it looks so casual. Investigators searched the body for some form of ID, but came up with nothing. There was no wallet or cash, and the name tags of all of his clothes had been carefully snipped away. One of his trouser pockets had been repaired with an unusual type of orange thread. The immediate investigation revealed a few facts. The body had not been in the water. Death appeared to have taken place whilst he was sleeping. There were no marks on his body, no signs of any violence or a struggle. What there were signs of, however, was poisoning. The post-mortem revealed blood in irregular areas of the body, such as the stomach. His liver was distended, his pupils unusually small, and his spleen was about 3 times larger than it should be. Strangely, the toxicology report showed there was no poison in his system, despite all signs pointing towards it. In fact, no cause of death could be decided upon. Some hypothesized that a rare type of poison may have been used, one where all traces of it died away quickly. Another irregularity was the man's calf muscles. They were extremely pronounced, more so than the coroner had ever seen. They were like that of a professional athlete's. The shape of his feet suggested that he had been in the habit of wearing high-heeled and pointed shoes. One expert suggested he may have been a ballet dancer. So, who was the Somerton Beach man? To this day, nobody knows. Sets of his fingerprints were analysed the world over, and people from all across the area came to try and identify the body. Some thought they recognised his face from the newspaper, though nothing ever came of this, and nobody knew who he was. What was discovered, though, was the dead man's suitcase, which had been left at the train station. Inside it was a table knife, a stencil kit, a reel of the same unusual orange thread, and some clothes. 3 items of clothing bore the name T. Keane, though it was later revealed that this wasn't the man's true identity, and that somebody had purposefully left these tags inside to fool the police. All other traces of the man's real identity had been removed. The police were stumped at this point, and it wouldn't be until 4 months later that a surprise discovery would be made. This discovery, however, only added to the confusion. Sewn into the waistband of the man's trousers was a small, hidden pocket. Inside was a crumpled up piece of paper, which contained only 2 words. Tamam shud, a Persian phrase meaning, "it is ended." The phrase had been torn from a rare poetry book, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. The plot thickened. 8 months after the man's death, the copy of the book had been found. 2 men who had been in the area at the time the man died had found the book lying in the back seat of their car. Silently, they just assumed it belonged to the other, and it had remained in the glove box ever since. They forgot all about it. When they heard about the case, they re-examined it and found that the phrase had been torn out from the last page of their copy. They came to the police immediately. Examining the book under ultraviolet light, a secret code was found on one of the pages. Nobody has ever been able to break it. And that's as far as anyone's ever come to cracking the case. Namely, not very far at all. We still don't know who this man was, who left the book in the men's car, or even what the code means. Nor do we know for certain how he died. The alleged use of poison, along with the fact that all identification had been removed from the body, have led many to speculate that the gentleman was some form of spy or a government agent. As such, he could have been assassinated. Others suggest this was an elaborate suicide. The man's body was embalmed to preserve one of the few pieces of evidence the police had at the time. It was then buried and sealed beneath concrete, ready to be exhumed if ever needed. For the next 30 years, at odd intervals, flowers would appear at the unknown man's grave. Nobody knows who kept leaving them there. Number 4. In 1948, a gigantic tornado swept through the town of Woodward, Oklahoma, causing massive destruction and claiming the lives of 185 residents. 4-year-old Joan Gay Craft lost her mother that day, and her stepfather was critically injured. She managed to survive the ordeal with minor injuries, as did her half-sister, Jerry. They were taken to a nearby hospital, and it was in the hospital's basement that both Joan and Jerry were sheltered, along with a number of other refugees who had lost everything during the carnage of that day. At some point during the night, 2 men dressed in army uniforms entered the basement and asked for Joan by name, claiming that they needed to rush her to another hospital where her stepfather was being treated. Joan protested, desperate not to leave her sister's side, but the men assured her everything was going to be okay and grabbed a hold of her. They stated that they'd be back for Jerry shortly, and that the two wouldn't be separated for long. Of course, members of staff confronted the men when they heard Joan's cries, but they managed to convince them that they were both officials. This did seem reasonable. Many of the victims were being whisked away to other treatment centers to help solve the capacity issues. Without further resistance, Joan was escorted out by the 2 men. They never returned for Jerry, and Joan was never seen again. As if it hadn't lost enough that day, the town also lost Joan. What's odd is that even these days, Woodward is an extremely small community, far from any other towns or cities. In 48, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. It seems strange that these 2 men knew to ask for Joan by name, and yet nobody else recognized either of them. They knew who they were coming for. Despite the case receiving nationwide attention, Joan was never found. Number 5. You're probably not intimately familiar with the work of the singer Q Lazarus, or her band The Resurrection. She's best known as the one-hit wonder musician behind Goodbye Horses, a song made famous in the horror movie Silence of the Lambs. It's actually a really awesome, if slightly eerie track, befitting of the scene that made it famous. If you don't know it, then pause the video here and go and check it out via the link in the description. It might help you appreciate the mystery behind the singer. A few months ago, Reddit user Myrna asked if anyone had any information about Q Lazarus after 1996. Like many others, they had searched and searched, but came up with nothing. It seemed unusual that after that point, there was no information about her online. The trail just goes cold. A few other users joined in on the search, and came up with some interesting leads. Here's what they found out. Q Lazarus's real name was Quiana Lucky. She moved to the UK to start a heavy metal band. Her ex-manager last saw her looking unwell. She became close to a Swedish hustler and cokehead who apparently cut her off from the rest of the world and filtered everyone away from her. Her songwriter, William Garvey, said that he was certain she was dead. Garvey himself died in 2009. Perhaps most odd is that she has unclaimed royalties, just waiting to be collected. Seeing how her music is featured in some prominent movies, this could be a significant amount of money. Why wouldn't she have claimed it by now? Even her old bandmate, Gloriana Galicia, says that she doesn't know whether Q is alive or dead. Now, don't get me wrong, I'd say this mystery is more odd than sinister. She became somewhat well known while the internet was still finding its feet. It wasn't like nowadays, where there's a plethora of information on every one-hit wonder that's ever graced the airways or a big movie soundtrack. Perhaps she just faded away into obscurity and is living a quiet life somewhere. Still, for someone who sang a song with such a cult following, it seems strange that she could just disappear from all public consciousness, without there even being a scrap of information on her well-being or what she's up to now. As the lyrics to her hit say, all things pass into the night. Here's a bonus entry. I thought it was interesting, but not really the same vibe as the other ones. It's an unsolved mystery 7,000 years in the making. In 1996, a group of German construction workers unearthed the prehistoric remains of a ritual site in Herxheim. The site was absolutely surrounded by mass graves, with at least 500 human bodies being discovered. The bones belonged to men, women, and children, from newborns to the elderly. Some of the site was destroyed by construction, but it's estimated that at least 1,500 bodies were buried there. Examination of the bones revealed the people had been butchered and eaten. In addition, bones from at least 200 dogs were unearthed as well. This begs the question, what happened in Herxheim 7,000 years ago? The condition of the human bones indicates that they were healthy at the point of death. Prior to being buried, the bones had been stripped of all flesh. There also seems to be no visible signs that the people died violent deaths, either via stabbing or bludgeoning. The reason that it's thought the people were eaten is because ancient livestock butchering techniques seem to have been used to remove the human meat, and the bones had been cracked apart and crushed to drain them of marrow. Gnaw marks are prominent on some of the bones, and the skulls of many had been carefully split, likely to remove the brains inside. Trinkets, talismans, and other knickknacks were buried along with the bodies, some from cultures as far as 500 kilometers away from the site. They had all been smashed or destroyed before being tossed into the burial pits. Since there seemed to be about 1,500 bodies buried there, it's impossible for it to have been a simple local graveyard. That number far exceeds the amount of people who would live in a single settlement at that point in history. This discovery gives us an incredible insight into our ancient ancestors. What it tells us precisely is, of course, a mystery. This could have been some sort of religious human sacrifice, or perhaps something more akin to an elephant graveyard, where the sick and dying from hundreds of miles away would travel to rest forever. That might explain why people from so far away could be found there, buried with their cultural artifacts. Maybe cannibalism was part of their ancient burial process. Why would their possessions have been destroyed though? Was this part of the ritual, or was there a more sinister reasoning behind it? Maybe they believed that one's own personal possessions were theirs and theirs alone, and that by smashing them they could deter grave robbers. Ultimately, we'll never know for certain. Regardless, it's a truly interesting thing to think about. Speculating about what happened all those years ago really conjures up some disturbing images in the mind. Any theories of your own? Hey guys, Lazy here, and thank you very much for listening. I hope you liked the video, a little change of pace I suppose. This was voted for by all my followers on Twitter, so thank you guys for voting for this. And if you liked it, I'll consider making something similar in the future. I want to say a big thank you to Anthony Salinas for the thumbnail for this one. Be sure to check out his artwork.
So my parents divorced when I was 7 years old. I have an older brother who was 9 at the time of the divorce, and my mum got full custody of us, and we would only see our dad every other weekend. My mum was a waitress, so she didn't have a steady income, and we struggled a lot. And because of that, we moved around a lot, because we were constantly being evicted from our homes. When I was about 10 years old, we settled down in a home in a not-so-great part of town. Despite this was the biggest and nice house that we had ever had. It was also really cheap compared to the other places that we stayed in the years prior. But there were always creepy things that happened in this house. For instance, our TV in the living room would just turn on and off by itself. One night, in fact, my brother and I were laying on the couch in our living room just trying to go to sleep. This wasn't uncommon for us, as we slept in there many nights throughout our time there. And our TV came on as we were dozing off. Angrily, I got up and unplugged the TV from the wall and sleepily crawled back into our couch. A little while later, I could hear the faint static of the TV turning back on. I got up and went to unplug the TV, forgetting that I'd already done this previously, and when I realized, I freaked out and pressed the power button on the TV to get it to turn back off. And after that, I didn't sleep much that night. A few months passed by, and I'm laying in my bed this time. I'm not really trying to sleep, I'm just kind of laying there, and it was really quiet in my room when, out of nowhere, I heard a tap on my window. It was like a tap that you'd make with the pad of your finger, not your fingernail. I jumped off my bed and ran as fast as I could to my brother's room, which was right next to mine, and I turned on his bedroom light and was hysterically trying to explain to him what had happened in my bedroom seconds prior. I was begging him to let me sleep in the room with him because I was afraid to be alone at this point. He agreed, and I got into his bed, and after a few moments of laying there, we heard the same 2 taps on his window. Well, without saying a word, we both jumped out of bed and ran into our mum's room. We were crying and telling her what had just happened, and she had been asleep and was irritated that we woke her up. She groaned and told us that we were probably just hearing things and that we needed to go back to bed. But as soon as she finished her sentence, someone tapped on her window the exact same way that they had done to my brother and I. My mum obviously shot up at this and told us that we could sleep with her that night. Somehow, we all managed to get to sleep that night with no further disturbances, but it was creepy. Another thing that happened was during the summer when my brother and I were at school. My mum worked every day from around 8 to 3 p.m, so she would leave us at home with her boyfriend at the time. He was a nice guy, but he didn't really do much. He just stayed awake all night and slept all day long. It was early in the morning and my brother and I were playing hide-and-seek tag. This is pretty much just hide-and-seek, but when you find the person, you have to tag them before it was their turn. We made sure to be as quiet as possible, so as we didn't wake my mum's boyfriend. I was the seeker and I found my brother, but before I could tag him, he just jumped up and ran outside. I chased after him and shut the door behind me, and after a quick loop around the house, my brother went back inside. He stopped at the door and I tagged him and laughed out, "You're it." He looked at me confused and I asked, "What's wrong?" He looked at me and said, "The door's locked." I thought that he was crazy and I went to open the door and sure enough it was locked. But it wasn't locked by the knob, the deadbolt was locked. Something that could only be done from the inside. We ran to my mum's bedroom and banged on the window trying to wake up her boyfriend. He was a heavy sleeper and actually never woke up to let us in. Hours pass and my mum comes home and lets us into the house. My mum had also told me that there were some nights that she was sleeping in bed and she would hear my brother screaming his lungs out for her as he had just seen something terrifying. My mum would jump up and run into his room, only to realize that we were at our dad's house for the weekend. She said that this happened to her multiple times too. One night at around 3 a.m, we were all in our bedrooms just sleeping soundly, but were woken up by a loud crash in our storage room. We all slowly tiptoed out of our rooms to find all of our Christmas ornaments broken on the floor. We had been staying here for over 6 months by this point, and our storage tubs were stacked neatly in our storage room. We also didn't have a cat or any other animal that could have knocked them over. We also had carpet, not hard wood, so all of the ornaments being shattered seemed just really unusual. Well, we cleaned up the broken pieces and we just went back to bed. The last thing that happened in that house before we moved out was actually while we were on vacation. My mum had a friend who let us stay over while we were gone for a week. He didn't have a house of his own and he sort of just hopped from couch to couch, so this would only make sense for him to stay over. About halfway through the week, my mum received a text from him and it read, "I'm sorry, but I can't stay here anymore." My mum walked into another room and called him to ask what was going on. After their conversation, my mum explained to us that her friend was sitting on her bed in her bedroom with the door cracked open, and he said that he had heard a noise and looked through the crack of the door and saw a little girl looking back at him. He said that he got up to check it out thinking that he was seeing things, and he said that when he opened the door he saw the little girl running away from him. She was apparently wearing a white dress, and he said that she ran into the storage room, and he explained that she didn't look scared and more like she was laughing, and it looked almost as if she was trying to play hide and seek with him. But after that, he just packed his bag and left, and I just never saw him again after that. We moved out of that house and nothing has happened to us since then. But surprisingly enough though, but we actually know the people who live in that house today. They have said that they've experienced some weird things, but they haven't really gone into detail about it. All I can say is that I'm just happy that I'm not living there anymore. My uncle had always told me about some strange things happening in my grandmother's house when he spent the night. First, I'm going to talk about his experience and then mine. I'll try and keep this short. So, to give some backstory on how this house is so haunted, my grandmother has had 2 miscarriages, 1 boy, 1 girl, and her husband, aka my grandfather, passed around the time that this all started happening. My uncle would tell me of events of pot smashing together to wake them up in the middle of the night and seeing shadows and all sorts of stuff. But his most memorable experience was when he was making food around 10 PM, when he asked my little cousin if she wanted any food. With the living room being right down the hall from the kitchen, he heard her reply yes. So he started making the food and asked if she wanted him to bring it over to her. Another faint yes was heard again, so he brings the plate down the hallway to the living room, only to find her dead asleep on the couch. He wakes her up asking if she had been talking to him the whole time, and she replied no. Why? Still groggy from just being woken up. This, obviously, sent shivers down his spine. Now, in my experience, my cousin and I had spent the night together at my grandmother's house to keep her company so that she wouldn't have to be alone there. But we went outside for a quick smoke and then went back in to finally get some sleep. He slept upstairs while I slept downstairs, and I turned the TV on for some background noise and passed out on the couch. It was around 2 AM when I was woken up to the sound of people whispering from the kitchen. Now, let me remind you that I was asleep on the couch in the living room, which is down the hall from the kitchen. So, me being the curious 17-year-old at the time that I was, I decided to see who was awake and what they were doing. The closer I got to the kitchen, the louder the whispers seemed to get too. And as I stepped into the kitchen, the whispers just stopped and I was left alone with only the sound of my breath going on. I could have swore that I heard people talking in here though, I thought to myself. I decided to look around the house a little more to make sure it wasn't coming from a different room, and after every room being empty, I just decided to brush it off and head back to the couch. I only made it halfway down the hallway though to the living room when I started hearing the whispers again. I couldn't make out any words, it just sounded kind of like a group of people talking together in a low voice. I decided to turn around one last time when again the whispers stopped and I was left in the kitchen by myself again. At this point, I was freaking out pretty bad, but decided to just sleep just to hurry up and get through the night. As I walked for the 3rd time back to the living room, I started hearing the whispers again coming from behind me. I didn't even look back this time though, and decided to just try my best to ignore it by turning up the volume on the TV. And after a little while, I ended up falling asleep till the next morning. When I woke up, I told everyone about what had happened, and to be honest, no one was surprised. My grandmother's house is pretty notorious for events such as this, and to this day, I still wonder where the whispers were coming from. I don't know what happened that night, but I can't help but think that it was spirits or something. When I was around 11, I had awful nightmares. Reoccurring nightmares, in fact, about a terrifying character, and they would always start the same. I would be doing something that brought me intense joy, though I can't really remember those parts, and at the height of that feeling, something would happen. Something out of a slasher film. I was absolutely terrified of anything bloody or insidious as a child. I remember my brother and sister actually sat me down to try and watch an episode of Family Guy to normalize that humor for me, but it was an episode where Peter and the chicken fought, and it was extremely bloody and violent, and I just lost my shit. I say this so that you know that I got disturbed very easily back then. But back to the dream for now. So, after something extremely satisfying would begin to conclude, a loud bass hum would fill the air and everyone around me would become instilled with what I can only describe as a primal fear. The looks on their faces would make me fall down and sob, and I would cover my eyes and I'd hear a slaughterhouse around me. There would be spilling of blood and the sharp pain from head-splitting shrieks and cries, and it was just honestly so fucked. And after a short moment of listening to my friends and family get murdered, the bass hum would stop and I'd hear someone run around quietly snickering to itself. It was as if a child was running around playing hide-and-go-seek or something. And then I'd hear complete silence as their feet would slowly form to the carpet or whatever surface it was. This dream usually took place in many different places, as they walked towards my backside. It would always stop at least 3 feet behind me, but I don't know why, and after some haunting silence, they'd speak, but it was always a different line, and here's a couple that I remember. There was, "I'm sorry, yeah, we've all heard it. I love my name, but let's just say it's Rob. Sorry, I'm busy." And this one, which the voice would say a lot, "So is it Sunday yet?" He would say something along with that sometimes, but I don't really remember now. His voice sounded like an older guy, deepening his voice, but also talking in a kind of kiddish tone, or just being a little goofy. It wasn't too deep, and it was also a little scratchy, and after that I'd wake up around 2 or 4 in the morning, unless I stayed up all night, which I'd wake up to be pretty late. So this all happened for a while, probably around 2 or 3 months, but when you're dealing with that stuff, it usually just feels longer, and it was also a long time ago, so it was probably shorter than that, but I'm not too sure. It didn't stop abruptly, though. I just had dreams less and less, and it really fucked me up as a kid, and it kind of changed me. It didn't turn me into a different person or anything. I just got much more serious and paranoid after that, which eventually went away. And now, I come to my actual experience. So, this was around 2 years ago, I think. I was living with my mum in an apartment, and I just went to the movies with 3 of my friends. We didn't really enjoy the movie or anything, and left early to head to my place, and we arrived, and all of us kind of slumped onto the furniture in the bedroom because we had walked back. So, as we sat down and I turned the TV on for my friends, I heard faint talking in the back, but my mum was home, so I didn't think much about it. We put on a Paranormal Activity show because we actually enjoyed that movie, but really we just sat and talked around and joked mostly. It was honestly a great night, and I had liked a girl that was there who was a friend of mine, and we were really hitting it off all night, but in the middle of us joking about the movie, I heard my mum call me. I hushed my friends and paused the movie and yelled, "What, Ma?" There was no answer, so I yelled louder, "Ma, what?" There was no answer again, so I got up and went to the entrance of the hallway, intent on going to my mother's room to express my annoyance for having to get up and see her, but I stopped at the hallway because I heard a weird guttural sound from the back. The sound also echoed, so I knew it was from the bathroom. I yelled, "Mum, are you in the bathroom?" and my friends laughed at this. And then I recognized the voice. And then I remembered my mum was in Chico for the night, and I stopped, and I'm sure I had that same look as the ones I remembered in my dreams. My friends thought that I was just fucking around, like I just saw my mum come out of the shower or something. But then the voice spoke loud enough for them to hear, and I'll never forget what it said. It was kind of a jumbled mess, but the voice said, "Yeah, tonight I'll pick you up. Then I'll rip you in half. But how? How? Rob will know. But no. How? Forget." During that whole dialogue, I told my friends that we need to leave now, and I rushed outside as they looked dumbfounded and confused. That last word was the last thing that I heard as I slammed the door too, and I'm sure it would have continued. I ran to the street and called my mum, and she then told me to call the police, so I did. They showed up and did their usual thing and then just left, and obviously there wasn't anything in the house. They told us that it was late, but that doesn't mean it wasn't our neighbours, and I wanted to believe that too, but I swear that it sounded exactly what I heard when I was a kid. And I swear that it was definitely in my bathroom. Well, after that, my friends told me that it was fine, and they all went home, hiding how scared that they were, probably trying to make me feel better or something. I knew too, because my best friend was supposed to stay over, but all of a sudden, his mum needed him to do stuff at 12 at night. I began to have a dream that night again, and I forced myself awake just as I heard that bass hum. I ran for the lights, and I didn't sleep much for the next week and a half. But I haven't had that dream since. I know I might sound crazy, but I know that I heard that thing in my house, and I know for sure that my friends heard it too. So, I'll get started with a little bit about myself. I'm 19 years old and currently live in the UK. Previously, I was an extreme skeptic of all things supernatural. Ghosts and demons and all those stories just never fazed me, as I can normally convince myself of a rational explanation. However, lately I've had strange experiences that seem to have changed the way that I think. Not about ghosts or that sort of stuff, but about aliens. You see, I've always had an underlying fear of grey aliens. Not an extreme phobia or anything, such as arachnophobia, where the sufferers can't even look or hear about their feared creatures. In fact, I have an extreme interest in the concept of aliens and wish to believe that they're real and we're not alone in the universe. However, something about the idea of grey aliens just presents me with an intense feeling of dread and despair when I think about them in my own life. I can't sleep being able to see outside or facing anything with a corner that I cannot see around. I also find it difficult to sleep without any kind of sound to distract myself with and help me doze off without much thought. Now, approximately 3 months ago, I encountered my first ever night terror. These were common for my dad, who experienced them for years. His night terrors, however, were generally funny, him seeing weird things like my nan's eyes glowing neon that woke him up screaming. My only night terror to date was very different. I laid in bed with my girlfriend and fell asleep, and I remember each part of the dream like it was real. I awoke in the same clothes, with the same sleeping position, with my curtains in the same position and everything. The curtains were slightly open, so I did struggle to sleep, but I didn't want to make a fuss and look like an idiot in front of her or anything. A boyfriend who can't sleep because he's scared of the tiniest side of the outside? Get a grip, man. The only thing that happened in the dream, though, was that I could see a face, a dead center of the gap in the window. It didn't move and it didn't blink, it just sort of floated there looking at me. Whatever it was, though, it wasn't human. Its face was long, almost shaped like a slice of pizza or something, rounded at the top and thin down to the point at the bottom. It may have been that it was blocked by the curtains too, but this was all I could see, and as much as I wanted to see, to be honest. Its eyes were large, too large, black as night, no pupils, no movement, just there, but I could tell that it was looking at me too. I felt the same sense of dread that I do with the alien fear that I have, feelings of my heart sinking and an inability to move, and in fear of what might be waiting around each corner. I awoke hyperventilating. In fact, the same hyperventilating I encountered at the end of my dream. My girlfriend woke me up in fear of what was going on with me, but I just shrugged it off as a nightmare. Ever since, though, strange things have been occurring in the house. My family had reported strange things happening before, but my lack of experience has led me to believe them to be explainable. Weird things that just happened for a reason or something, such as a lack of balance or wind from outside. The usual. My mother claimed that she had seen a man look at her through the doorway of our living room, but disappear when she looked directly at the area. Her and my brother's girlfriend also experienced the same dream on the same night, talking to twin girls by each of their respective bedsides. My brother and sister claimed to see shadows run past doorways, and my father claimed curtains moved on their own with no windows open. I never truly believed these claims until my experiences started. Since that night terror, weird things have been happening around the home which, to be honest, really terrify me. Items have flown from sides which we could not see but were impossible to fall. Entire books, which weighed upwards of 1 kilogram approximately, fell to the floor despite being completely on the side, with no parts over the edge. Loud bangs were heard at night from our downstairs that scared our animals and sounded like gunshots, but nothing moved upon investigation. As I live in the UK, it's also extremely difficult to get a hold of firearms, and nobody, as far as I know in our local area, has even held a rifle, let alone shot one in their house. Our cat continues to look at things too, which just aren't there, following them around rooms with their eyes, which dilate to their maximum level, looking at nothing. Knocking has been heard at our back door too, which is made entirely of glass, mind you, meaning that we would see anyone who would do it. Our technology constantly bugs out too, with lights flickering constantly, light bulbs lasting no longer than a few weeks at most, and Wi-Fi in our home being ineffective despite constant upgrades and extenders. It almost feels as if something is blocking electrical signals, especially in my room, as I plugged a cable straight into the router that connects to my Xbox 2 floors up, which one night was just pulled out from underneath my door, despite being so tightly wrapped anywhere besides just outside my room that pulling on it from anywhere other than there would conclude with failure. The weird experience, though, was straight after we heard the knocking on the back door. I retreated lazily up to my room to just play video games, and the top landing light was broken again, meaning that it was not on, and no other upstairs room lights were turned on, with my door being shut, and suddenly a bright blue flash occurred as if it originated from my room, almost as if someone had just used an extremely powerful torch that filled the entire floor for a second, despite my door being completely closed. I have no idea what these things mean, and I try to explain away, but I feel as though each event just keeps drawing me back to that one night terror with that face that scared me to death. Even as I write, I can feel that dread engulf me. I'm unable to stay calm, and feeling as though around every corner something just continues to peer around and watch my every moment. I just want to know what's wrong, to be honest. If it is psychological, then what can I do to fix it? I don't know if it is aliens like I believe it might be, but that dread that I feel with the face, these events, and my previous feelings about aliens are one and the same, and I want to know what I can do to just make it stop. At the time this story took place, I was about 13 years old. My parents split when I was pretty young, and my mum had to provide for my sister and myself, and my mum is really honest and thorough with her work, so she found it rewarding to clean offices and houses for money. My sister and I often went with her to clean up too, and by the time that this story took place, we were pretty used to it. So, my mum had 3 buildings she cleaned regularly, which we came up with nicknames for. There was the main building, the red building, and the brick building. Brilliant, I know. We had to clean all 3 buildings that night, so we started with the red building. This, out of all the places that I've ever been to help my mum, was my least favourite. I hated going there. It looked normal from the outside, mind you, but every time I took a step inside, I felt depressed and uneasy. It was like all the purpose of life had just been sucked out of the world, and I just wanted to fall asleep. At this time, it had been a while since we had visited the red building, and there was this bathroom in the surveillance room that needed a clean badly. The surveillance room was usually locked, and I actually had never been in this room. The first thing my sister and I noticed was the wall of monitors, each displaying the feed of the security cameras that were everywhere in the building. We had some fun playing around with the monitors, making one of us stay in the surveillance room while the others make faces and stuff in the camera in another room. I would like to mention too that my sister and I have a close relationship, and we've always just been weird. We both laugh at jokes and stupid stuff, and we also like to scare each other. Anyway, our mum got onto us about goofing around and assigned us both some jobs. after about an hour and a half of scrubbing and vacuuming and whatnot, we were almost done, and my mum was in the break room kitchen and my sister was hovering somewhere nearby. I was extremely tired by this point, and I just wanted to lie down or do anything except work. I was watching my mum prepare the water to mop the kitchen with when she asked me if I would like to mop or go and turn off the lights upstairs. I was so exhausted that I was only thinking about not doing work, so I decided to turn off the lights and I headed up the narrow stairs into the kitchen. The layout of the upstairs was odd since it used to be an apartment building. But there are 2 sets of staircases on opposite sides of the building, and I went up the ones in the kitchen. The other set was in the entryway of the front door. At the top of those stairs there was this hallway too that I always like to avoid. So I started turning off lights one by one, and I was thinking about how we still had 2 other buildings to clean and I needed to pull myself together. I blocked out my surroundings and was effortlessly flipping switches. But the second that I walked into the hallway that I try to avoid, I became a little more aware of what I was doing. Ever since I was little, I've been afraid of the dark, so I started turning off the lights in the offices that surrounded the hallway. I got carried away in shutting off the lights, to which, when I reached the point to turn off the hallway light, I jumped from a small step in an office doorway to the center of the hall. The hallway ceiling was really high, so the light switch was actually just a string that dangled from it. I wrapped my hand around the string and pulled, and as soon as the room went dark, I was filled with dread. And then I heard a very soft grunt coming from behind me. It sounded like when a person dies naturally and their body relaxes or something, so all the air in their lungs is just released. As soon as I heard it, my whole body stiffened with fear too, and adrenaline, and I started to sweat. It felt like if I turned around, I was going to die or something. Like whatever I saw, if I looked behind me, would consume me whole. I felt so powerless and terrified, and I didn't know what to think, and just that if I stayed there any longer, I was going to get hurt. My body took over my mind through adrenaline, and I ran down the stairs faster than I knew I could. I ran directly into the surveillance room, hoping that my sister was in there, and I called out her name. No response. I was so desperate and terrified that I ran over to the monitors and started scanning for anyone near me that I could run to. The first movement I saw was in the screen that showed the stairs that I had just run down, and I saw my sister walking down them with her coat and Boba Fett hat on with a mop in her hand. I took a deep breath and lied down on the couch that was in the surveillance room, and I was so relieved that it was my sister. I knew that she had just scared me and that she always did that, and it made perfect sense. I had thought that she mopped the kitchen and then followed me up the stairs and took the opportunity to scare me. After I calmed down, I walked into the kitchen where I saw my mum and my sister talking. I leaned on the island counter and told my sister that she scared me, and she looks at me and asks, "What?" I repeated myself, and she asks when she scared me. I told her that she came up behind me upstairs when I was turning off the lights, and I laughed and asked if I looked dumb running down the stairs. Both my mum and my sister weren't laughing though, but they were staring at me with confused faces, so I asked them what. My sister began to say that she was downstairs talking to her mum ever since I walked up to turn the lights off. I told her that I knew that she was lying because I saw her on the cameras walking down the stairs. I described that I saw her holding a mop and that she was wearing both her hat and coat. And then my mum chimes in that my sister wasn't lying and that they really were talking. I began to think at this point that my mum was in the joke too, so I told my sister to follow me to the surveillance room, and I pointed to the exact monitor I saw her walking down the stairs on. And that was when she told me that she took off her coat the second we walked into the building and hadn't put it back on since. She also only walked down those stairs once with the mop, but that was way earlier. I was confused and a little bit scared, and when we packed up our things and we got into the car, my sister told me what doppelgangers are. I never knew what they were before this, and I had never heard a story about them either, which only makes it more terrifying for me, to be honest. I thought of every way that I could rationalize this, but nothing just ever made sense. First, I thought maybe the footage wasn't live, but then remembered how my sister and I were playing with the cameras. Maybe I was just paranoid about the dark, but I do know for sure what I felt was real. I still don't fully understand what happened, and I wonder what would have happened if I had turned around instead of running. Anyway, I know some people are bound not to believe me, but I'm thankful for the people that don't think I'm crazy because they've experienced the same exact thing. So my father has had his fair share of strange and paranormal encounters in his lifetime so far. However, one experience that really stuck to him took place in 1982 when he was 13 and still living in the Philippines. He was attending school at Christ the King Missionary Seminary in Quezon City, a Roman Catholic institution that prepared students for priesthood. Obviously, my father never followed through with the program, thank goodness, as he admitted that he was never really serious about becoming a priest and that joining the seminary was really just a means for him to live more independently. And apparently, this story is partly responsible for changing his mind. So, my father and his friends, John, Rob, Richard and Nick, all attended the seminary, but none of whom actually became priests either. Go figure. Everything stemmed from when Nick got sick with the flu one time. He was quarantined in the seminary infirmary so as to prevent other students from getting sick, as was standard procedure. And no one thought anything of it, to be honest. It was when he was released 2 days later, though, that things started getting weird. My dad explained that Nick came back acting abnormally reserved and just quiet. Instead of laughing and joking around in the mass hall, he would just stay silent, sometimes with his head down and sometimes just staring blankly at the window, never looking at or talking to anyone. One day, though, during lunch, my dad and the rest of the group noticed tears running down Nick's face as he just quietly cried at the table, head still down and still refusing to talk to anyone. Concerned, my dad and his friends notified one of the seminary regents, sort of like a cross between a youth leader and an RA, and Nick was summoned into the regent's office. The group approached the regent after the fact, asking what was up with Nick and if he was okay. The regent explained that after asking Nick what was wrong and if he was okay, Nick finally admitted that there's this man who's following me and I didn't want to say anything because I didn't think anyone would believe me. Nick was then asked to describe the man who was following him, and he explained that the man was wearing a pair of jeans but was shirtless and he apparently had no face. According to the regent, after Nick described what the man looked like, he completely snapped, panicking and sobbing, yelling things at the regent like, "I really don't want to see him anymore. Please, I don't want to see him. Just help me. Please help me." The regent, along with the prefect, who was sort of like a school principal, a priest, who were also present in the office, had to hold Nick down as he was just completely distraught. After praying for a bit, they were able to calm Nick down and assured him that they'd always be available if he ever needed anything before dismissing him from their office. Although disturbed by the incident, my father initially thought that maybe excessive stress might have been the cause of his friend's outburst or something. However, it should also be noted that the possibility of ghosts and demons and other malicious entities were no surprise to the seminarians, as new students were always initially warned that because the seminary was a house of reformation and that students were preparing themselves to carry out God's work, resistance coming from opposing entities who wanted to drive out students were common and to be expected. Either way, my dad and the rest of the group gave Nick his space for the next couple of days, assuming that he just wanted to be alone for a while until he felt more like himself. That is, until the night things came to a head. Now, everyone was in their dorm rooms, and Nick and my father and their friend Richard had their beds situated right next to each other. Everyone was setting up their mosquito nets and getting ready to sleep when a sudden shout from Nick just startled everyone. He began yelling, "Get away from me." According to my father, his outcry was followed by 2 aggressive swings as Nick tried to fight off some unseen assailant. And what happened next, my father still truly doesn't know what to believe. He apparently watched as Nick's head just whipped back as if he was struck by a blow to the jaw, and then his whole body was forcefully thrown into the air. My father, although somewhat religious, is still a fairly skeptical guy, and he claims that the way that Nick's body was shoved back just seemed genuine, with no bend to his knees to justify him simply just jumping back like that. If it was all just in his head, then my dad stated that Nick was a really good actor. But the night only got stranger from there. As soon as Nick was struck by this unseen force, he got knocked unconscious and the regent was called immediately, followed by the prefect and priest. Together they carried Nick into the regent's office. As disturbed and afraid as my father was, he, John and Rob ended up trailing behind them, partly out of concern but mainly out of plain stupid curiosity. The doors of the regent's office were shut behind the group, and my father was immediately regretting being so nosy. The room was incredibly tense and thick with fear. It was evident on even the priest's face that he was wary and reluctant of having to deal with Nick and a possible demon. The regent, prefect, and priest all figured that my dad and the group would stick around to help with praying over him and help him regain consciousness, and they quickly do as instructed and start praying the rosary. As if the night wasn't already creepy enough, halfway through praying the Hail Mary, my father's friend John just starts to talk complete gibberish, and what my father could only explain as speaking in tongues. After this nonsensical outburst, John promptly collapses, and luckily the priest was quick enough to catch him and set him on the floor before he hit his head on anything. At this point, my father is just confused and terrified as all hell, wishing that he'd never decided to join the damn seminary in the first place, and that he could just be safe at home instead, watching episodes of Three's Company with his dad. Of course, there wasn't much else that they could do at that moment, other than continue to pray and hope things got better. John regained consciousness shortly after, almost as if nothing had happened, although noticeably confused. My father actually asked him what the hell caused him to talk like he did, to which John replied with a repeated, "I don't know." They finished praying after a while, and Nick was still unconscious. Deciding that the group had done all that they could do to help, the regent, the prefect, and the priest all agreed that the boys should go back to their dorms and get some sleep, telling them that Nick would stay in the office with them overnight, presumably to continue watch and pray over him and perhaps call medical authorities. The group obeyed and returned to their dorm, rejoining the rest of the students who were just as unnerved and unable to sleep from the night's turn of events. My dad's friend, Reggie, whose bed was right next to his, meekly asked him if they could share a bed, as he was too afraid to be alone, to which my father agreed. My dad remembers that he and Reggie were shaking so violently from fear that he could hear the bed frame shake as well, something that he laughs about now, despite being so unsettled at the time. The next morning, Nick's parents picked him up from the seminary for a 2-week leave, and apparently when he came back 2 weeks later, Nick was just back to his normal self, and no one ever brought it up after that. A while after these events, long after my father and his friends had left the seminary, Nick had a falling out with a group over personal issues, and so my dad is just no longer in contact with them. John is still a close family friend though, and my father will sometimes bring this story back up with him, and he's considered extreme anxiety or paranoia and everything as possible explanations for what happened at the seminary. However, those are all just theories, and they really don't fit all that well. It remains something that my father just still cannot fully explain. I mean, the fact that he had a flu and everything could explain why maybe he was having some sort of hallucination, but the way my father describes that night when he was like punched and pushed and thrown into the air or whatever it was, he still wonders over that. I'm from Canada, Alberta, and that's all I can really say is I have to keep things as private as possible. I've worked at this nursing home for about a year and a half as a cleaner and a food server now. I usually work the late cleaning shifts, and as of late I've had weird things happen. Things just keep progressing the longer I work here too. And things are especially strange in one area of the building particularly. I can assure you that this is all 100% true as well. I used to be skeptical about things like this until I started working here. So, here's when it all started. I went in to do my late shift as any other day, but please note that I'm also pregnant in these stories. So late shifts include cleaning the dining rooms and the kitchens and doing all the laundry from that day. But mind you, this is a really big old facility and I'm working alone on late shifts. There's 2 dining rooms that can sit 70 people at least, and 1 kitchen and 1 laundry room that have those big industrial washers and dryers. So there is always lots of cleaning to be done. I was doing my usual routine, sweeping the floors of the first dining room before mopping it, when I suddenly smelled a really bad odor, and it made me sick to my stomach. I thought that maybe the cooks had left some rotten meat in the trash can, but to my surprise, all the garbages were cleaned out. I went back down to the dining room, though, to figure out where the smell was coming from, and I followed the smell down past the kitchens and into the hallway where the rooms are. This was the east wing of the building, and there's only 5 residents living in this area of the building, and it includes our laundry room area as well. This wing is the older wing that has yet to be renovated, so a lot of the rooms are empty. I followed the smell down the hall, all the way to the empty room at the end of the hallway, and I knew nobody lived in there. I knew all my residents well and where they all lived. This room is room 218, and you could just smell the foul odor emanating from the door. I assumed that the cleaning ladies from the morning had left a trash bag full of rotten food in there or something. They often leave things behind while cleaning, so no harm done. I thought I'll just throw it out myself. But because of fire safety policies of our facility, I had a master key that unlocked all the rooms. I unlocked the door and opened to the room, and the smell just hit me and almost made me puke right there. Covering my nose, I proceeded to walk into the room as there was an immediate noticeable change in temperature. It was like the AC had been running in this room all day, and I just had a terrible uneasy feeling the whole time that I was in there, and I immediately wanted to leave. I searched the room quickly for anything that could be making the horrible smell, and I was confused when all there was an empty closet and bathroom. I just thought that maybe it could be a dead animal stuck in the wall and I'd have to leave a note to my manager. I unlocked the door and started down the hall, and then suddenly I heard a really loud knock against the door. A chill ran through my whole body as I turned around to face the door, and I was sure nobody was in there as I'd just been in there. And then I heard it again, but this time much louder, twice as hard on the door in fact, and I felt pale. Being the pregnant and cowardly girl that I was, I just began to run down the hall as fast as I could manage. I didn't know what or who or what the hell was going on with that room, but I felt that I had a reason to be afraid. I got back to the kitchen fast and dialed 911 on the phone, as I was sure that someone had broken in and was messing with me. I told the operator that it was a possible break-in, and they told me that there was a policeman on patrol 2 minutes away, and I sighed at my luck and waited at the front doors. When the policeman finally showed up, I explained everything as I showed him what room. He went down the hall and cleared the room, and he told me that nobody was found, and the room had still been locked. Even the windows were untouched, and he said that there was no smell. I was startled by this because only a few minutes ago, I could have sworn that I smelt rotting meat and heard the knocks. I ruled it out as my tiredness and my pregnancy brain at the time, and he took a report and went on his way. Mind you, I was still very uneasy as I finished up my shift, but this was the first time I've experienced anything paranormal. The second time, again, I was working the late shift one night and I was in the laundry room just finishing up the last bit of my shift. I was folding the laundry and was just caught in my own thoughts. Now, this room has really large windows. But being late and dark, you can see your reflections in the surrounding room through the dark windows too. I looked down at the laundry and looked back up, and my heart stopped as I saw an old man with black dark eyes just staring back at me, smiling. I screamed and looked behind me, thinking that it was a resident messing with me, and to my horror, there was nobody there. I felt really uneasy as I looked around, and I looked out in the hall, but there was nobody there either. I said hello, but there was no answer, and after that, I felt sick. I finished what laundry I had left and locked up the laundry room, and as I was locking the door, I could see an elderly man standing at the end of the hallway in my peripheral. I turned to look, and it was the man who was just behind me a few minutes ago. He was smiling, eyes grey and black. I take note that he definitely isn't familiar, and he's a tall, heavier man wearing jeans and a white t-shirt that's tucked in. He was a bald man and clearly elderly, and he was just standing there, smiling at me. The smile sent shivers down my spine too, and I thought maybe that we got a new resident and my manager just forgot to mention it or something, and so I called out. Hello sir? Do you need anything? I'm Belle and I'm working on the night shift. It's nice to meet you. I managed under my intense anxiety. But he just stood there smiling. If you need anything, feel free to call the staff phone, okay? I'll be over in no time. I was so very uneasy and just wanted to go back to the staff room, and he just stood there continuing to grin. I smiled back and waved nervously, and I said, have a good night, sir, and feel free to call me if you need anything, okay? I walked away in a hurry, and just as I got back to the staff room, the phone started blaring. I looked at the caller ID, and it's coming from 218. I felt really uneasy, but it must have been just a new resident or something, so perhaps he was just too shy to talk to me. I didn't know. But I hesitated and finally answered. Hello, sir? How can I help you tonight? There was a deep, crisp growl from the other end of the phone, and it didn't sound at all human. It scared the shit out of me. And then the phone just went to static. Hello? Hello? I said, nervously. The phone went to dial tone, and I sat there for I don't know how long, and my heart was pounding in my throat. Due to safety protocols, I had to go check on the resident too. As much as my instincts told me to avoid him, I walked nervously down the east wing, my heart pounding in my ears. I came to room 218 and I knocked on the door and asked if the person was okay. But there was no answer. So I knocked again and still no answer. And I became concerned. What if my resident was attacked by something? That growl, it definitely wasn't human. But I was also pregnant and didn't want to storm in and be attacked by God knows what. So I turned around to get the phone from the staff room, and then I heard the door creak open very slowly behind me. I walked over to the door slowly, and before pushing it open, I said, hello? Sir, are you alright in there? I pushed the door open at this point. I was expecting something or someone to jump out at me, but when I opened the door, there was nothing. Nobody in the room and no belongings that would imply someone lived there. It was just completely empty, but I had a terrible feeling like I was just being watched, and I searched the room and that smell of rotten meat filled my nose again. And then I heard the most terrifying laugh, and it burst through my ears like knives. It was such a deep and low and just cackling laugh, and I literally shit myself as I ran out of the room so fast. I didn't even bother to shut the door, and as I was running, I was thinking to myself, am I going crazy? I could have sworn that there was no one in there. I mean, I didn't see anyone. What the hell's going on? That night, I finished my shift quickly and I just walked the fuck out of there early. I didn't give a shit about spending one more minute there. But sadly, this is not where it ends. Due to being a soon-to-be single mum and pregnant, I had no other option but to stay here until I was on maternity leave, as my husband died a few months ago due to a drunk driver hitting him. He was supposed to come home that night to cook a meal and at my positive pregnancy test and all that, and he didn't even get to know that he was going to be a dad. Anyway, I was stuck there for a while, but that's where I'm going to leave it off for now. If you guys would like to hear more of my experiences, then please be sure to leave a comment below, as I definitely have more than a few to share. Thanks for listening. So I live in the UK and am a 21-year-old female. I run a B&B and am pretty used to having to make weirdos feel welcome. However, they are mostly harmless at the end of the day. But last week's experiences was by far the worst and most terrifying. It all started on the Monday night of last week. It was the end of summer break, so a lot of tourists were travelling around my area, so it was good business for the B&B. Staying in one of the 7 rooms, I had a foreign couple and their baby. In another room, 2 girls who had travelled from Australia, and in the attic room, I had a lone man who, to be honest, I got bad vibes from at the very beginning of meeting him. He was tall and had long greasy hair and dirty unkempt fingernails, and altogether he just looked very dishevelled. He didn't really talk too much either. He just asked what room he would be staying in and walked in there and shut the door behind him. Still, nothing too out of the ordinary in my opinion. Unfortunately though, it didn't stop there. Now, I spend most of my time in my personal hobby room. I mostly watch TV for a lot of the days and then just go upstairs to my bedroom to go to sleep. I climbed the tall staircase and went to my room and I checked my alarm clock, and it was only 9:30 PM, so I thought I might just lie down and watch some videos on my computer. Halfway through watching my favourite movie, I was interrupted by a loud knocking on my door. It wasn't an average knock though, it was really aggressive. I looked through the peephole in the door and was surprised to see that it was the strange man who was staying in the attic bedroom. I opened the door and he started talking straight at me, not letting me get a word in, telling me that the water pipe in his room had burst and that there was water spurting everywhere and that he wanted me to fix it. I obviously apologized to him and, without questioning anything, let him lead me to his attic room. But the first red flag was the fact that he shut the door and locked it behind him. The next thing was that there was no water anywhere. And then I remembered that there were not actually any pipes anywhere in the attic. I don't know how I forgot, but I guess I was more worried about the guy asking for a refund than actually questioning whether he was being legitimate about the whole pipe burst thing. But now, I was stuck, and the only other people who were staying at the B&B were 2 floors below me, so they would never be able to hear me scream. I'm also a woman, so I had no chance of being able to fight off this guy. I looked at him, and he shot me a yellow grin, and he lurched for me, but I leaped out of the way. I noticed something sticking out of his pocket jacket, and it was a knife handle. He pretty much ripped it out of his pocket and started swiping at the air with it. I bolted out of there and heard him running at top speed behind me until we got to the 2nd floor, where I heard him running back up to his room. I locked myself in my room and called the police immediately. I also called the other guests on their landlines and told them to lock their doors and stay in their rooms. When the police arrived, they found the man hiding in the wardrobe in his room. I guess that he freaked out when he heard the sirens and just hid in there. Apparently, he only had one backpack, and it contained a toothbrush, duct tape, a Stanley knife, a Phillips head screwdriver, and some intimate things which I can't even write down, but I'm sure you can guess what I'm talking about. They never found out for sure what he had planned on doing to me, but from the contents of his bag, we all had a pretty good idea. But they took him away in cuffs, and thankfully, I've never seen the guy again. I plan on moving away at some point soon because I just don't really feel comfortable with him knowing where I live. Also, every day I just see that grin that he gave me as he was taken away and his wild eyes. This is definitely the most scary experience that I've ever had. So this is a story that my mum told me from her childhood. I've put it in my own words, but have not changed any of the details of the events. So here it is. Memories are odd. Every time that you reflect on one, you skew it just a bit, and after years and years, your memories become a disfigured version of what actually happened. It's kind of like that grade school game, telephone, where you whisper something to the person next to you, and then they whisper what they think you said to the person next to them, and so on, and by the time it gets back to you, the phrase being passed around is nothing like the original phrase. I've often wondered how different my childhood was compared to how I remember it. How many details have changed, how many things I recall that may not have actually happened at all. I fully accept that not everything is as I think it was, and I'm fine with that. One memory, though, haunts me in vivid and precise brushstrokes. Funny how the ones you'd rather forget seem to be the ones that just refuse to relinquish their clarity. The memory I'm referring to takes place in October of 1986, just outside of Dallas, Texas. I still remember the dress I was wearing. It was yellow with white polka dots, long sleeves, and went all the way past my ankles as per my parents' religious requirements. I hated that dress, but at 11, my parents didn't yet think that I was capable of choosing appropriate attire for myself. I hated it because it was rather hard to move in, and my mum had made it herself, and it was pretty tight from mid-thigh down. Anyway, my sister, who was a bit older than me, had just gotten her driver's license, and she wanted to take the car out. My mum said that she could as long as she took me with her. She agreed, grabbed the keys, and off we went. We left around 6-ish, and it was already getting dark, but my sister, who was a little uncomfortable behind the wheel, wanted to drive in the evening so that she would have less traffic to deal with. Well, we also stuck to the side streets and back roads until we worked our way to a stretch of relatively desolate highway. So we'd been driving around just listening to the radio and embracing our first true taste of freedom for about an hour. We were just circling back and forth along some 10 or so miles of the USHW 80 between Mesquite and Forney, Texas, just outside of Dallas. It's a little busier there now, but back then it was just a 10-mile stretch of trees and railroad tracks. It was there that we heard the engine clunk, and my sister's novice driving skills became apparent as the car sputtered a few hundred yards before dying and rolling to a stop. We'd run out of gas, and the closest gas station was a few miles back. This was before cell phones, so the only thing that we could do was grab the gas can from the trunk and walk back to the station. Remember that poorly constructed polka dot dress? Well, this is where that comes into play. After about 100 yards, it was obvious that it would be more trouble than it was worth for me to hobble behind my sister for several miles, so she handed me the keys and told me to just wait in the car. I got back in the car and locked all the doors and just watched the rear window until my sister was out of view. I was a very meek and timid and easily frightened little girl at the time, and it didn't take long for the dark to infiltrate my psyche. But there were no street lights, and I hadn't seen another car since my sister left. But the only light was from the moon, which was full enough that I could see the thick tree line about 30 yards off the road. After what seemed like an eternity alone in the dark, my fear and nerves began to really fray. It was completely silent, and not even the crickets were chirping. I became acutely aware of just how unnervingly silent it was. I wanted it to end, but at the same time was afraid of what might end it. So I just sat petrified, almost anticipating to hear the boogeyman's whispers in the wind at just any moment. All I could think to do was to try and fall asleep, and hopefully by the time that I woke up, my sister would be back. I leaned the seat back and closed my eyes and tried my best to just block the boogeyman from my mind. Another 15 minutes or so passed while I turned this way and that way, just trying to find a halfway comfortable position. It was in the midst of the fidgeting that An eerie feeling just ran down my spine. A feeling that I just wasn't alone, and it was a feeling of unshakable dread that I was being watched. I was lying on my side facing the steering wheel, looking downward at the floorboard, my back to the passenger window, my eyes pressed tightly shut, and I was afraid to open them, afraid of what I couldn't see, of what I might, in fact. I took a deep breath and counted to 3 and opened my eyes, and there was nothing there. I took another deep breath and quickly shifted my gaze to the driver's side window, and I exhaled, seeing nothing there either. You're okay, I told myself. I sat there wide-eyed, just staring straight ahead, focusing on the steering wheel for another 10 minutes or so. And that's when all at once, and all of a sudden, I felt stricken with a paralyzing sense of terror, and the voice in my head just started repeating, "Don't turn around." My heart began racing faster in my chest, and my body stiffened and my limbs felt so heavy as an inner panic had started to take hold. I tried telling myself that it was all just in my head and there was nothing outside of my window, that I was just working myself up. But to my utter horror, however, a shadow shifted off the driver's side seat and then filled it back up again, followed by 3 taps on the glass behind me. That shadow had been covering that seat since before I had even opened my eyes, as I had hardly blinked since opening them. That means that whoever or whatever was outside the car had just been standing there, watching me. As this terrifying thought ran through my head, there were 3 more taps, louder this time, and I knew that I couldn't just ignore them anymore. I mustered up all the courage that I could and turned to meet the tapper. Hello? I nervously whispered as my eyes tried to focus on the figure outside the window. Aren't you a little young to be out here all alone, little lady? Where are your parents? His voice was deep and had an authoritative tinge to it. As he spoke, chills went down my spine. Suddenly, the air felt cold and the night felt sinister. The man was abnormally tall, the top of the window well below his chest line. His hands were extremely muscular, and his fingers long and needly. As my eye tried to focus, he bent his enormous slender frame over enough to peer in the window. He was clean-shaven, revealing extremely sunken cheeks and eye sockets too. His eyes themselves were bulging outward and seemed too large for his face, and while it could have just been the night, I swear that they were completely black. "Little girl," he repeated, "I asked where your parents are." I'm with my sister, we are..." He cut me off and pulled out a flashlight shining into the car. "I can't understand you. I'm gonna have to ask you to roll down the window. It's alright, I'm a cop." The ambient light from the flashlight allowed me to see that he was in fact in an officer's uniform, and for a brief moment, relief hit me. Rolling down the window, I spoke a little louder. "I'm with my sister and we broke down and she went to get some gas. I couldn't go with her because I can't walk in this dress." A slight grin came across his face. "Ah, I see. So you're not out here all alone then?" he said, almost gleefully. Yes, sir. Just until my sister gets back." "And when will she be back then? The closest station is a few miles away. That could take a while, right?" My relief was starting to dissipate as the familiar feeling of looming dread returned. I don't know. She's been a couple of hours now, I guess." He said. "Tell you what, why don't you come with me and we can go and get your sister? You won't have to walk. How does that sound?" It hadn't dawned on me until then, but I suddenly realized that I hadn't seen any headlights in either direction for 20 minutes by this time. I turned to look out the rear window and started to tremble as I confirmed that there was in fact no car in any direction within any eyesight. "But where's your cop car?" I almost hesitantly asked. "Right over there, just through the trees." He pointed to the tree line in the distance. "Haven't you ever wanted to ride in a cop car?" I think I should just wait here for my sister to get back. She won't be much longer. Look, it's past curfew, and if you don't get home soon, I'll have to arrest you, okay? Your parents won't like it if you get arrested now, will they? Now, a new fear entered my 11-year-old brain. The fear that I could be arrested. But my instinct said to not get out. I'm sorry, sir, I said, rolling up the window. I really should wait for my sister. As the window was about an inch from closing, he stuck his fingers through trying to stop me, and I ended up smashing them between the door and the glass. He shrieked in pain, pulling his hand back. Oh, you fucking little bitch! You smashed my fucking fingers! Oh, I'm sorry, I said through the now closed window, backing up in my seat as far from the door as I could. He started pulling on the door handle violently and shaking the car back and forth. Open this fucking door, you little bitch! Do you know how long you'll go to jail for resisting arrest? He pulled out something that looked like a nightstick and started banging on the roof of the car and the window. He smacked the window again, and a spider web of cracks erupted from where the club struck. Now, I knew that it was only a matter of time before he got in, and was afraid that he'd follow through on the promises of making things worse. I said okay through frantic sobs, not even realizing that I had started crying at this point. He suddenly got completely calm and said, Well, all right then. Go ahead and step out of the vehicle and follow me to my car. Yes, sir. I rolled up the window and stepped out of the car. This way, he said. Tremors ran through my body as I slowly began to follow the man. I knew that something wasn't right, and all I could think was that he was leading me into something unspeakable behind those trees. I wanted to run, but with my dress, I wouldn't make it far before he caught me, and where would I go even if I could? We were about halfway to the tree line, 40 feet away, when headlights lit up the field that we were standing in. Come on, he snarled, grabbing my arm and pulling me along at a hastened pace. We were 10, maybe 15 feet from the trees when the shouts started. The headlights were now beaming directly on us like spotlights from heaven when several voices, all female, started yelling in our direction. They started yelling, "Get away from that man, little girl. That man's not a police officer. He's a bad man. Let her go, you demon. God is watching you. Little girl, come here to us and get away from the bad man." They just sent a barrage of shouts until the man let go of me and ran into the trees. They yelled to me to run to them as fast as I could, and so I did, as hard as I could, ripping my dress in the process. Two women in thigh-length dresses stood outside the open side doors of an old white church van. They urged me to get in, and I jumped inside into the arms of another woman and heard the door slam behind me. There were 6 ladies altogether inside the van, all older, larger women. "It's all right, sweetie. You're safe now. We won't let the bad man hurt you, okay?" One of them reassured me. I said through tears that I have to wait for my sister, and they reassured me that they'll wait here and keep the bad man away. Every so often, they would start yelling for me to not look out the window and pulled me into their chest to shield my eyes. But curiosity got the better of me, and I peered out against my better judgment, prying my eyes sideways away from the woman who was holding me. And what I saw still haunts my nightmares. It was the man, now completely nude, running down on all fours in and out of the tree line, and through the field between us too. I don't know what he was doing, but he was moving quickly and kind of in an unnatural way. Sometimes he'd come as close as a few feet from the van and just make the most disturbing guttural grunts and growls that I've ever heard. The ladies tried to distract me by singing nursery rhymes and gospel hymns, and anytime he got too close, they would roll down the windows and shout him back. He would disappear and reappear like clockwork until finally my sister appeared, gas can in hand and on the road behind us. I told my sister what had happened, and she said that the worst feeling had come over her and she was running the whole way back. The ladies surrounded us, forming a big circle around the car as my sister filled it with gas. The man was now standing 10 feet outside of the tree line, his clothes back on, watching us the whole time, and he looked and just never spoke, as they told him to just leave us alone and not get any closer. When the car finally started, the lady said that they'd follow us to make sure that we'd make it home. We went up about half a mile and made a U-turn to head back, and as we crossed past the place that we'd been stranded, the man was on all fours again, completely nude, sniffing at the pavement where we'd been stranded. The old church van was behind us almost the whole way home, and I never took my eyes off of it. I was afraid that somehow the bad man would get us if they weren't there, but as we turned on our street, I lost sight of them, and they didn't turn in behind us, nor did I see a single vehicle pass on the cross street. Maybe they just turned around and just left, I thought at the time. My mother was waiting out on the front porch for us as we pulled up, and it was obvious that she'd been crying. She said that she'd gotten an awful feeling that something bad had happened and we'd been gone a long time. I told her everything that happened, and she called the police, who came to the house to take a statement. I thought that was the last time that I'd ever hear about that bad man, but unfortunately, a couple of months later, I saw a news story about a girl that had gone missing from a park close to the area where a car had broken down, and witnesses said that the last they saw of her, she was talking to a tall, lanky man in an officer's uniform. Sometimes I think back on that night, and I shiver when I think of that bad man. Other times, though, I think of the ladies in the van and how they showed up just in time and how they just vanished without a trace. I wondered then, and I still wonder now, if maybe I was being protected. I'm not too sure, and I know that whole thing just sounds a little bit crazy, but man, what a weird night. The following account happened several years ago in Nepal. I travelled there with my sister Em and two of her friends from high school, V and A. We'd hoped to escape the hustle and bustle of the city life and immerse ourselves in the mystical mountain paradise, to enjoy its culture as well as trek along one of the many Himalayan trails. However, limiting circumstances forced us to go during monsoon season, a combination of increasing heat and humidity that results in almost incessant rains. So, as you can imagine, there was scarcely a tourist to be found, especially on the hiking trek. Dense sopping clouds had snuffed out any meagre light, and milky fog obscured the view more often than not as we trudged along the circuit, but we had a blast nonetheless. The trek itself warrants a telling of its own, albeit a far less serious one, what with V falling victim to a battalion of bloodthirsty leeches lured out by rain, and A getting entangled in escapades, nearly getting knocked out cold from flirting with a farmer's wife. Though battered and bruised, we emerged from the trail victorious, though, and returned to the capital. Our flight back home was due the very next morning, which meant that we only had one day to explore Kathmandu. Kathmandu is quite a polarizing place, with labyrinthian streets and alleyways riddled with kitschy aesthetics and stimuli that push one's senses to their limits. Navigating Kathmandu by yourself, especially at night, is next to impossible, in fact. The heavily polluted air and suffocating traffic doesn't help either, and really, the only one among us who took a liking to the city was V, but she was always big on everything South Asian and was smitten by the various temples. Which is why, with strain leaking from our muscles, our limbs jittering from our 2-week-long odyssey, we were dragged along and subjected to her ministrations on spiritualism and greater meaning and whatnot. By the time that we staggered out of our final sightseeing destination, the Monkey Temple, it was almost dark. We kept casting apprehensive looks backwards, prepared to fend off the prowling gangs of thieving monkeys skittering in our wake, looking for any opportunity to dispose us of food or the next best thing. One of the little buggers actually took off with my glasses, in fact. As we were descending into the city, having left the temple grounds, our luck got cursedly worse. We heard thunder echoing back on itself in the distance. Clouds, feathery and alive, billowed up at an alarming rate, their colour morphing from shades of purple to jet black, flecked with lightning. It started raining too, and heavy rain that pummeled us as we sought shelter. We splashed through ditches already knee-deep with rainwater and hurtled down alleyways where we hid under a tin roof at the side of the road, our drenched clothing clinging to our skin. Just as we were catching our breaths, a flurry of wet motion appeared in the corner of my eyes. My sister, Em, had darted onto the road and swung her hands upwards. She was always spontaneous and decisive, explosively so in fact, and when she spotted distant white headlights, barely discernible through the downpour, she gambled on it being a taxi, and it paid off. We clambered into the Suzuki with a collective sigh of relief, the prospect of immediate shelter overshadowing the struggle to create space for our bags within the tiny vehicle. It was an impossibly tight fit, but we somehow managed. The scruffy-headed driver, whose calm and deliberate tone of speaking weirded us out a bit, turned around in the near-pitch blackness of the taxi and asked us with a toothy grin where to. We looked at each other in momentary confusion before realizing that we hadn't accommodated this final day spent in Kathmandu into our plan, and because of our unfamiliarity with the city, had no idea what to say. The driver seemed to pick up on this, though, and didn't hesitate to suggest taking us to the Cousins Hostel, an excellent establishment if he were to be believed. Out of options and utterly exhausted, we just meekly consented. With thinly masked glee in his face, he told us that we'd love it there and that the first round of drinks was on him. Careening through the streets, we tried to respond to the driver's prying small talk, but the hypnotic ding of rainfall on the roof was all it took. As I watched the blur of passing objects and people through the rain-speckled window, like wavy apparitions, I plunged into sleep. When I woke up, we were still in the car and everybody else was asleep, and in spite of the piss-poor visibility and my grogginess, it was evident that we were in a completely different part of the city now. But there was little to no street lighting, and all I could make out were jagged outlines of poles and looming concrete walls and structures. But no people were to be seen, and unease crept up on me. How long had we been driving for? Where exactly was this person taking us? What quelled my suspicion, and what made us go along with such a shady plan to begin with, was the perceived nature of the people of Nepal. Every single Nepali that we came across was welcoming and kind to a T, which, along with the supposed safety of the country, had lulled us into a false sense of security. It hadn't occurred to us that this fickle trust could be easily exploited. The driver had noticed that I was awake and flashed that toothy grin at me, telling me that it was good timing and to wake the others. When I stepped out of the car onto the muddy, deserted street, I couldn't help but feel the sense of unease sliding through me again. It was a sentiment, too, that was beginning to be shared with the others as we took in this Cousins Hostel. We were taken aback, though. Mold-flecked walls with degraded and worn renderings surrounded a house that, despite being camouflaged by the darkness and rain, was unmistakably dilapidated. Granted, it was only marginally worse than the rest of Kathmandu's post-earthquake infrastructure, but it gave off a disconcerting air of ruin. In other words, no way in hell were we about to stay here. At least one of us was preparing to voice disapproval of the entire situation when the driver started bounding around and, in a very animated manner, attempted to usher us through the opened rusted gate into the awaiting yard. We complied, but only to get out of the rain, as it was now flooding over the alleyways created by the narrow lanes of houses and carrying with it its swirling refuse. When we stepped inside, we were met with a carnival of just disgusting imagery, illuminated by a single dim light bulb suspended from tarp that covered most of the yard. Revulsion and dread supplanted whatever unease that we might have harbored, because it was just beyond repulsive. What I can only describe as a sickening miasma covered everything, and it just reeked of foul odor that made my eyes water. The concrete ground was littered with waste, and the walls smudged with caked dirt. The single plastic table was just smeared with who knows what, and I shit you not, there were needles just scattered everywhere. We immediately knew that we needed to get the hell out of there, but it was only when we turned around and looked at the driver under the light that the seriousness of our predicament fully dawned on us. This man looked like diseased roadkill. Sunken, bloodshot eyes stared at us from a face that was just covered with livid sores and scratches. His toothy grin now revealed decayed and cracked teeth, and we were definitely in a drug addict's den. Holy shit, V, I thought. How did you not notice? I mean, you were sitting right next to him. I wasn't sure how to react at this point. He was just standing there, blocking the gate, staring us down. He obviously didn't pose much of a threat. I mean, there were 4 of us against one frail drug addict meth head. Well, 3 of us at least. V's always scared easily, and as I glanced at her, I noticed that she was visibly shaking. She'd be useless should things escalate into a confrontation, verbal or otherwise. A, too, for all his loud bravado, he was the first to peel when shit hit the fan. I was starting to get really nervous at this point. I mean, what if he had a weapon on him? A used syringe which he'd lash out at us or something? The last thing I wanted was for one of us to contract something. My mind was racing. How were we going to leave? I was certain that there wasn't a taxi within miles of this deserted hellhole, that's for sure. And where were we to begin with? Our phones were useless without local numbers. I cursed myself for being this obliviously careless. As I was being dissolved by the acids of anxiety, M spoke up. Honestly, she was everything one could possibly want in a leader. Level-headed and perceptive, and she managed to bolster our confidence by taking control. She calmly addressed the driver, trying to explain to him that we'd forgotten to take care of something and that we'd need to rush back to town. We'd pay him double the fare for the trouble, but he wasn't having any of it. With wild gesticulations and an irritated tone, he started speaking rapidly. We barely comprehended him in his frantic state. He was saying that it would be impossible to drive back under these conditions and that our best bet was to just wait it out at the bar. He stressed multiple times that the first round was on him, as if that would entice us. He pointed towards the house, and it's then that we noticed the interior of the house was completely dark. The wide doorless entrance like an ominous invitation into nothingness that lay beyond, threatening to swallow whoever dared to approach. He told us to follow him inside for the drinks and started waving his hand as if time was of the essence. He was starting to rile me up, and I felt like giving him a verbal beatdown, but as if sensing that, Em reacted. She realized how important it was to keep level-headed and told him coolly that we simply had no time, and if he wasn't capable of driving, then he would help us contact another taxi or something. He either didn't understand or willfully ignored her and kept urging us to come inside with him, though. It got to the point that he just kept repeating the same thing over and over, eyes dimmed to a sickly grey and flesh sunk at the side of his mouth. He kept insisting. And if this wasn't all enough, there was a very hostile air about him too. He looked like he was making a concerted effort not to lunge at us, fidgeting with shaking hands. If necessary, I wouldn't have felt bad for a second to topple him like a sack of laundry if he so much as tried anything. V spurted out, very unspiritual-like, "Fuck this, let's just leave." At this, he surprisingly went quiet, as if unsure what to do faced with our departure. He turned around and stared at the house and then back at us. He hissed, "Okay, I get phone." With surprising agility, he scurried off towards the entrance too and disappeared into the darkness. We looked at each other and there was a momentary silence, the only sound that of the rain beating against the tarp and lightning booming in the distance. V again says, "Fuck this," traces of panic in her voice this time. She says, "This isn't normal, we need to leave now." I said, "And go where? You saw for yourself that there's not a soul out there and it's raining cats and dogs." Despite trying to be the voice of reason, I knew M felt the same thing all of us did, a lingering sense of dread that something was just horribly wrong. A was fidgeting too now. Fear had obviously burrowed into his heart, and I too felt afraid. That's when we heard it though, faint rustling coming from inside the house, crackling followed by the unmistakable sound of whispering. My heart was now beating like a drum. I felt jelly-legged and none of us moved a muscle. We were all petrified. The whisperings continued too, and they were just barely discernible through the rain, but loud loud enough to be picked up. With my eyes trained on the blackness of the entrance, I slowly started inching backwards, and the others followed suit. Just as we were turning around, it happened. The sound of heavy footsteps rushing us, a stampede emanating from within. We bolted, dashing through the gate into the street, and from the corner of my eye, I saw 4 of them mere steps behind us, with another bounding through the house entrance. They started shouting and shrieking at us as we hurtled down the street, sprinting desperately before turning to a side road. One of them threw something at us, in fact, and it fell short and landed with a sickening thud behind me. We ran blindly and turned corner after corner, knowing that a single misstep would kill any of us. V was falling behind us, though, panting like a horse pushed far beyond its limits. Thankfully, the shouting was becoming fainter and fainter, though. We kept running, not daring to catch our breaths or reorientate ourselves, simply following M's lead through roads and alleyways. At one point, I thought my heart would burst, and just when I was ready to give up, V almost out of sight too, we finally spotted headlights. We must have seemed like lunatics, surrounding the car left and right and center, banging on the windows, screaming for help. It was a miracle the driver, an elderly man, decided to help us at all, in fact. We clambered inside, gasping and heaving, and we wasted no time telling him to hightail it out of there. It took us the better part of an hour to calm down, and V was just hysterical. A's entire frame was trembling, but once this experience infiltrated our minds, we just never felt safe, even when stepping onto the aeroplane out of Nepal the next morning. We decided against going to the police in the end. I mean, we had no evidence, and even if we did, we had no way of finding that house again. Our backpacks were lost, of course. Mam's forethought of keeping our passports in her waistpack spared us much suffering, luckily. To this day, I'm still filled with dread at the thought of that entrance into darkness, with murderers lying in ambush. It was 2004 and I was 19, and my friend, B, was renting the upstairs bedroom of a house that everyone knew as the murder house. You see, in 1987, a man was shot in this house. He ran outside and banged on the neighbor's door, leaving a blood smear on the door and a trail of blood from the house. No one answered, and he was dragged back into the house by 2 men and brought to the basement, where he was shot in the head and subsequently dismembered. And the men took his remains and dumped them in a reservoir. So yeah, this was our little town's dark secret. B had been living there for a few months, and I would come over most nights after I finished work. I was delivering pizzas, so I always had cash from tips, and we'd do what 19-year-olds do, try and get some beer or whatever. Funny enough, we'd usually just hang out with whatever was around and put some music and play rummy. I know, hard partying, right? But he never felt uneasy in the house. He never bought into the whole haunted house aspect. Despite that, though, he just never went into the basement. No one, except the owner, in fact, went into the basement. It wasn't a rule or anything. We could do whatever we wanted there, really, but the basement was just no. So one summer night in June, we're all at our friend Todd's house. He was older, but a cool guy, and he didn't mind a bunch of teenagers hanging out. He liked the party scene, I guess, and so we were there. It was me, B, a girl named AJ, and C. We were all broke at the time, and Todd had some other friends over, more his age, that we just didn't feel like hanging out with, so B says that we should just go to his place and figure out what we're going to do for the night. AJ and C take her car, and I take B in my shitty old Toyota pickup that forever smelled like Pizza Hut. B's house was only a couple of blocks away, and we get there and head upstairs to his room. This being 2004, not everyone had cell phones yet. Only AJ had one, so we were all trying to think of who to call to salvage the night and whatnot. There was no luck, so I put in a CD, and we just proceeded to go to the old reliable boring deck of cards. It was just the 4 of us in the house, the owner of the home had his dog in the room right next to us. He was rarely home at night, though, and His room had a window that overlooked the front yard and the street. We barely got the first round started when we began to hear footsteps on the stairs. Must be Frank coming home, B said. We didn't think too much of it until we heard the front door open and close and then more steps on the stairs. We all looked at each other and checked the window, and we didn't see anything suspicious, but we also didn't see Frank's car. We heard footsteps coming up a third time, and B and I had had enough, and we were going to confront whoever was trespassing. We were both 19, and I had been a football player in high school and was still in pretty good shape. B had never played sports, but was in a similar condition as me. Basically, we could have held our own in a fistfight if need be, but usually we could just intimidate people into backing off. So, it's about midnight and we head down the stairs. AJ and C stay up in the room. We were both pumped up, ready to go kick out any drunk or meth head that happened to just wander in. We don't see anyone and nothing looks out of place though. We go outside and sit on the porch and nothing seems odd. There's regular traffic on the semi-busy street, but I start to get the feeling that just something's wrong. Something feels off. I see things in the front yard that look like they're moving, like shadows darting around. I kind of dismiss it as me being tired and my eyes just playing tricks on me. That is, until B asks me if I'm seeing the shadows moving. I ask him, "Yeah, you're seeing this too, huh?" I go into the yard at this point and look up into Frank's bedroom window. There's a lamp on, giving off just enough light to see the bedroom door and the dresser. I look at it for a minute when I see something. I say to B, "Dude, there's something in the bedroom." He replies with, "It's just the dog." "No, it's not. That's not a dog. It's kind of black," and the black creature comes into full view of the window at this point. It looked like it was just made out of oil. Not quite solid, but not translucent either. It moved from the window to the dresser to the door and then just disappeared. "What the fuck are you talking about?" B asks, still on the porch. I don't know, man. I don't know what it was, but I don't even know if I saw anything. It may have just been my eyes fucking with me. I walked back up the steps onto the porch and noticed an old mirror that had been left by the door. I remembered hearing stories about people using mirrors to see ghosts, so I figured why not. B had gone into the yard to try and see what was in the bedroom at this point too. I stare into the mirror for a few minutes when I see a black oily ball floating down one of the pillars behind me. Dude, there's something floating, it looks like a little ball of," I said. The ball disappeared out of view of the mirror and reappeared behind me, huge this time and black, a translucent black oil behind my reflection. I couldn't see the yard anymore and I couldn't see B, and for a moment, all I could see was me, the porch, and this thing coming behind me, and then I felt it. Fingers made of ice entered into my shoulders and pulled me backwards. It's an impossible feeling to describe, but every time I think about it, I can kind of feel it. I bolt away from the mirror and I say something just went through me. Something, that black thing, it grabbed me and it pulled me backwards. I was done at this point and B was freaked too, so we hustled over to the gas station down the street to call AJ from the payphone and have her and C get my keys and shit and just get the hell out of that house. AJ asks us, "Where are you guys? And we heard you guys walk up the stairs, but you never came in." I say, "I'll explain later, just grab my keys and CDs and meet us outside." Back at the cars, I told them what happened and what I saw, and I don't know if they believed me or not, but all I knew is that I was terrified. After that incident too, I never went back to that house, and B moved out a short time later. Oh, and if you're interested, you can do a YouTube search for the Boyce Murder House, and you can find news stories about the place there. Thanks for listening. So, to start, my boyfriend and I had just bought a house together. It's a lovely two-story home with an attic, a basement, and a two-door garage as well, and we got it for a steal. But with that, we have no seller's agreement. But the owner has never seen the home, probably inherited it, to be honest. Either way, we were in a pinch, having been evicted from our apartment and taking care of foster pets. It narrowed our options, as many renters around here don't allow pets. So, before I get to the main story, some backstory on us. I'm a 20-year-old female and my boyfriend is a 30-year-old male. I'm pretty skeptical about things like this too, but that doesn't mean I haven't seen some things personally that really do make me wonder. Those are stories for another day, but what I'm about to tell you is about something that I had always thought was an old wives' tale, but now I don't know anymore. Anyway, I'll call my boyfriend P for now. We also moved in with a good friend of mine and her boyfriend. They rent a room from us and it helps with the mortgage for sure. But they're 3 and 4 years younger than me, and I'll call the girl M and her boyfriend E. Now, E and I had set up a man cave of sorts in the basement. We game and drink and basically just sort of do our nightly routines of getting some distance from our partners down there. Meanwhile, P and M set up workstations in the attic. More of a refined space for them for writing and tinkering with old typewriters and whatnot. We've been settling into the new house for a couple of months now, getting used to its pops and creaks, and it's an older house built in the 1920s, and my neighbours sort of have mice on their side of the attic, so you can hear them skittering about and above your head. In this time, I've been noticing some small things that seem odd though. The upstairs bathroom kind of gurgles, if that's the right way to say it, but only I've ever heard it. When I asked P, M, and E, none of them had heard the same noise. It was weird, but whatever. Downstairs, we also have another bathroom almost directly under the upstairs bathroom, just past the kitchen. Now, my cat follows me everywhere in the house, squeaking at me to hold him and just generally being a cute cat, but he won't follow me into the bathroom without being coerced. He'll just sit there and kind of manically squeak at me until I usher him in. When he does finally decide to follow me in, he locks eyes with a portion of the hallway and won't break eye contact with it. And then he'll run to me while staying low to the ground. I know that this is a sign of fear, but he has no reason for it, and I just can't explain it. And aside from that, he's recently started going into the bathroom by himself and just howling at the wall. It's weird, but cats, right? Now, E and I have our setup in the basement, which gives me the creeps, to be honest. I wouldn't spend much time in it at all until I put a huge sheet of fabric along the walls that looks like a vertical striped wallpaper. Now, when I put this up, I made sure to cover a doorway that leads to a small room under my front porch. Something about that room just bothers me, and it feels like it's watching you. In between the matches of the game that I play, a sudden realization that I have that feeling again always comes upon me too. And every time, it's always that same room. It has no door, and I occasionally still feel it despite covering it. My cat avoids it too. But just last week, he told me about an event that he went through while I was sitting right next to him. We had both been gaming and had some time between matches and decided to shoot the shit and complain about shitty teammates. The usual MOBA player bullshit, right? Anyway, he tells me later that during our chat, he had hallucinated his girlfriend M walking downstairs and into the basement with us, but when he turned to talk to her, she just wasn't there. I just kind of laughed it off, as he spends a lot of time smoking and maybe he was just confused. But earlier tonight, while I was in the basement alone, I heard someone open the basement door and heard and saw M walk down the stairs and behind me towards a chair or a cigarette or something. But when I turned to her to talk to her, there was no one there. I immediately looked behind me, but there was no one in the room. I looked in the entire basement and even called for her, but nothing. Once I realized she wasn't there, my cat howled and just booked it right up the stairs. I sat confused for a few minutes and told my buddies that I'd been gaming with that I'd be AFK for a bit. I felt almost lost, to be honest. I decided to text Em, though, from the basement, but sure enough, she hadn't come down the stairs at all. She'd been up in her workroom for hours, which means that whole time she was 2 full stories above me. So then, what did I just see? Or better yet, who did I just see? My father died in 2008 when I had just completed my high schooling and we were in enormous amounts of debt. I still am in poverty, but that story can be told another day. So, to continue my studies, I needed to find work, and for 3 years I sold picados on the street and taught little children maths. In 2012, I was recruited into an ISP in our small town to work the night shift. During the interview, I was particularly asked if I would feel scared to stay alone at night in the 3rd story of the enormous building with one security guard in the ground floor. I was never comfortable, but I needed the job. Plus, being at a night shift, I could attend my college during the day and all that. So, I worked in that office between February of 2012 to August of 2013, and during this time, I never got curious to ask anyone why no one wanted to work at night. I heard, before me, that someone used to work at night, but he just left abruptly. My work was to pick calls from clients who would have problems with their internet connection and provide simple solutions. Anything complex, and I had to note down their names and address and pass the list to my senior via email, and technicians would take care of them during the next day. It was a simple job, and I wouldn't receive many calls, and so, by 11, I would just spread out a thick blanket on the floor and fall asleep with the receivers beside my head in case somebody phoned. June 2013, though, was the month that I found out why no one was ready to work at night. That night, the security guard with whom I had developed a very close friendship came to the 3rd floor and asked me if he could sleep in my room as there were too many mosquitoes in the ground floor. Understand that he was supposed to stay awake, but he used to take advantage of my altitude and sleep every night, and the whole building had no security camera. Anyway, we were both sleeping in the same room. The 2 receivers were on either sides of my head, and the lights were turned off. I had locked the door loosely, keeping the lights on in the corridor. And at 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound as if someone was walking with his feet dragging to the floor. It was a really strange sound, and really loud too. I was facing the door and could see the light on the other side of the door through the thin gap between the floor and the door. I stayed down, staring directly at the gap, trying to understand what or who it was, and as I waited, the sound got louder and louder, and soon I saw feet of someone crossing my door. My heartbeat got faster, but I thought that it must have been the security guard, but when I looked behind me, he was fast asleep. My blood froze at this, and the sound started to get louder again, and soon the feet appeared near my door. This time, instead of just crossing my door, it stopped there too and didn't move. I waited for whoever it was to move away, but he wouldn't. And then I did the stupidest thing. I thought it could be an intruder, and instead of waking up the security guard quickly, I tiptoed to the door while the thing still stood there and pulled it open suddenly. And there was no one, but a gust of wind hit my face, causing me to get goosebumps all over. I woke up the guard now and explained to him everything. He took out his torch and turned on all the lights and searched the whole building, but couldn't find anyone. Finally, he came to me and said that it could be a demon. Well, after that, I couldn't sleep again. I dropped messages to those who worked during the day explaining this shit too, and I reached the office the next day a little early to catch the others. This was when the story started to emerge too. One explained to me that He had the night shift a few days, and he would always hear someone climbing up and down the stairs in the middle of the night. Another said that he saw a chair being moved around from one corner of the terrace to another by something that wasn't visible. And that was apparently why no one would like to work at night, and stayed there for more than a year. I left the company in August after they gave me an increment of $3 after working for more than 1 year. They used to pay me $54 a month, and yes, I know, the salary is scarier than the story, but I needed to grasp anything that I could find to complete my bachelor's degree. I used to attend college in the morning and teach from afternoon to twilight and then go to the office. The cost of education and staying alive plunged me into further debt from which I'm yet to recover completely. But they install cameras in the office these days, and I sometimes wonder if they've been able to capture anything. I have plans to upload my personal paranormal stories, including this one, to my newly opened channel, Many Realities, someday, where I share strange but real stories of people around the world that defy explanation. I'd love to see you there, but that was my story, and man, it was weird. So my parents divorced when I was really young. I do remember after the divorce that they both lived in apartments in the middle of Tennessee. Well, not long before I was to start kindergarten, my mum remarried to my stepdad and we moved to a small house in the middle of nowhere, Alabama, about 30 miles outside of Birmingham. It was in a good school district and near my stepdad's family, who would be helping with my brand new little sister. This was actually a really exciting time for my other little sister and me, and we finally had cousins, aunts and uncles and grandparents that we would get to see all the time instead of traveling for the holidays to New England or Florida only once or twice a year. We didn't even care that they were all step-family, we were just happy to be around other people. The cousins that we saw most were Brady and Micah. Their mum and our mum worked odd jobs to make ends meet and helped each other out with childcare, while my stepdad worked as a truck driver and Uncle Randy worked as an EMT ambulance driver. So our house was an odd setup. We lived in a little 2-room house that actually sat almost right behind a large old farmhouse that no one lived in. Whenever Brady and Micah would come and visit, we would always end up going through the house and always wondered why it was still set up like a house since no one lived there. The beds in the bedrooms were made, there were a couple of plates in the sink in the kitchen for the last few years. It was like someone just left for work one day and never came home. So after a day of playing in the house, I found a plate in the kitchen that I thought was very pretty. I knew that we were about to go visit my grandparents in Florida for the summer and thought that it would be a perfect gift for my Southern Belle plate-collecting grandmother. I took it back home, and my mum helped me clean it and get it ready that evening before sending me off to bed. After my mum sent me to bed, she followed her nightly routine of smoking a cigarette, dumping the ashtray, sweeping off the porch before locking it, and then watching the nightly news before going to bed herself. While she was in bed, she kept smelling a burning cigarette, though. She couldn't figure out why, though, and even got up to check the garbage to make sure that her last one was not still lit. And it wasn't. So she went back to bed. She's almost asleep, convinced that the smell is just stuck in her nose, when all the lights in her room turn on. She turns to get out of bed and comes face to face with me, standing next to her bed, clutching my blanket and crying. She asks me why I turned on all the lights, and I just break down crying and barely get the words out. I say that I didn't turn on any lights, not even the ones in our room or in the living room. Carolyn did it. I told her to stop and turn the lights back off, but she just laughed at me. My mum was really confused and asked who Carolyn was. I explained that Carolyn is my friend that I made. Normally she just turns on some lights at night, and she didn't have lights in her house next door until she was 6 like me and likes to play with them. But when I tell her to stop and go home to sleep, she turns off the lights and walks away. But tonight, she turned on all the lights, and when I told her to stop, she laughed at me and walked into our closet instead of going home. And now, she doesn't want to leave, even though I want her to, and she made fun of me. My mum got out of bed and picked me up, and as she was carrying me back to my room, she quickly discovered that every light, every lamp, every ceiling light, even the pull chain lamp under the kitchen counter, they were all on. She took me to my room and laid me in bed and checked the closet just to make sure that Carolyn wasn't in there, and turned off the bedroom light so that my sisters wouldn't wake up. She went out into the hall and reached for the light switch, but before she could even touch it, every light in the house just went off. Mum was convinced that we had lost power, so she hit the light switch to check, and the whole light came back on like normal. As odd as it was, she just put it down to faulty electrics and went back to bed. As she laid in bed, the cigarette smell came back though, and she sat up trying to remember if she smelled it while dealing with me, or if she was just too preoccupied and freaked out to notice. While she was trying to remember, she heard the screen door to the back porch open and slam shut again. Of course, she knew that she had locked it before going to bed, so she wasted no more time and picked up the phone and called Uncle Randy, since this was before the prevalence of cell phones, and it wasn't like my stepdad would be able to make it from Arkansas back to Alabama in any time quick enough for the circumstances anyway. So, for 12 minutes, my mum just sat frozen in her bed, scared to move, listening for any other sign of an intruder or that of any of the three of us had woken up. Then she heard a car pull up into the driveway, followed by Randy banging on the screen door and yelling her name. She ran to the kitchen and threw open the back door, turned on the back porch light, and immediately saw it. Between her and Randy were about 20 burnt cigarette butts and cigarette ashes just strewn across the floor that she had just cleaned an hour before, and a locked screen door. So, to start, I need to give some background. I'm a male who lives in a relatively nice neighborhood. It's your average small-town run-of-the-mill suburbs area with a lot of people there. I'm a college kid who's home on break while my parents have gone away, which doesn't help at all. I also have a 2-story house, and I don't have a gun, or nor do I have any real weapons other than kitchen knives. I'm not on any medication, and I have no record of schizophrenia or any other mental illness. I barely have any relationships with my neighbors, most of whom are elderly, and the rest I have minimal contact with. I don't have any people in my neighborhood that I know of anyway who have any reason to attack or harm me too. So, let's get into what's happening. About 2 nights ago, I woke up very late in the night and I went to the bathroom to go and take a dump. Now, my 2nd-story bathroom has a window that can see the entirety of my backyard. But directly behind it is a cul-de-sac which you can see directly into. There's a group of trees and a pile of rocks and mulch that divides it. Usually I can see everything in my back room without turning anything on because lights from my neighbor's house dimly light the room. And as I'm using the toilet, I look outside and I notice there's a car parked directly facing my house in the cul-de-sac. Now, if you've ever seen a cul-de-sac before, you would know that when you park, you always either park next to the curves or the sides of the street. This car was directly facing the curve behind my house, though. I thought that this was pretty strange, considering whoever parked must have been there to visit someone, but if that were the case, then why would they not have parked in one of the driveways? The people who lived behind me were both elderly too, so they probably didn't have some big block party I didn't know about or anything, and even then, only an idiot would park like that. As I stared into the car, I could distinguish a figure in the driver's seat, just sitting there. Since the lights were not on in my bathroom, whoever was in the car probably couldn't see me through that window. At this point, I was determined to see who the fuck was in there, so I went downstairs and got my binoculars from my dad's closet and went back to my bathroom to see who was there. Keep in mind that this is 3 in the fucking morning, and what person would be in their car just sitting there in the middle of the winter? Anyway,